Philosophy. Confucius, Aristotle, Lao Tzu, and Zeno. Written by Philip Rivaldi. Narrated by Doug Green. Chapter 1. Confucius. Confucius, or Kongzi, was a Chinese philosopher who was alive in the 6th century BCE and whose ideas, uttered in the philosophy of Confucianism, have impacted Chinese civilization all the way up to the present day. Confucius has become a bigger-than-life figure, and it is difficult to separate the reality from the myths. He is seen as the very first instructor, and his teachings are usually uttered in short phrases which are open to various interpretations. Chief among his philosophical ideas is the significance of a virtuous life, filial piety, and ancestor worship. Also emphasized is the need for good-hearted and frugal rulers, the importance of inner moral consistency, and its direct connection with consistency in the real world, and that rulers and mentors are necessary good example for broader society. Confucius's early life. Confucius is actually believed to have lived from circa 551 to circa 479 BCE in the state of Lu, now Shandong or Shantung. Yet, the earliest written record of him dates from some 400 years after his death, in the historic records of Sima Qian, or Sima Qian. Raised in the city of Qufu, or Kufu, Confucius worked for the Prince of Lu in different capabilities, especially as the Director of Public Works in 503 BCE, and then the Director of the Justice Department in 501 BCE. Somewhat later, he traveled widely in China and consulted with several minor experiences, including imprisonment for 5 days due to a case of incorrect identity. Confucius met the event with normal restraint and was said to have calmly played his stringed instrument until the mistake was discovered. Eventually, Confucius returned to his hometown where he developed his own school in order to provide students with the teachings of the ancients. Confucius did not consider himself a creator, but rather a transmitter of these ancient moral traditions. Confucius's school was also open to all classes, rich and poor. Confucius's functions. It was even though he was teaching in his school that Confucius began to write. 2 collections of poetry were the Book of Odes, Shi Jing or Shi King, and the Book of Files, Shu Qing or Shu King. The Spring and Fall Records, Lin Jing or Lin King, which told the history of Lu, and the Book of Changes, Yi Jing or Yi King, was a collection of writings on divination. Regrettably for posterity, none of these works laid out Confucius's philosophy. Confucianism, because of this, needed to be created from second-hand accounts, and the most dependable documentation of the ideas of Confucius is considered to be the Analects, though even here there is no absolute evidence that the expressions and narratives were actually said by him, and typically the absence of framework and clarity leave lots of his theories open to individual analysis. The other 3 significant sources of Confucian idea are Mencius, Great Learning, and Mean. With Analects, these works make up the 4 books of Confucianism, otherwise referred to as the Confucian Classics. Through these texts, Confucianism became the official state faith of China from the 2nd century BCE. Confucianism. Chinese philosophy, and especially Confucianism, has always been concerned with practical questions of morality and ethics. How should man live in order to master his environment, supply ideal government, and achieve ethical consistency? Central to Confucianism is that the moral consistency of the person is straight related to extraterrestrial consistency. What one does impacts the other. For example, poor political decisions can cause natural catastrophes such as floods. An example of the direct correlation between the physical and the moral is evidenced in the saying, "Paradise doesn't have 2 sons, and the people do not have 2 kings." A consequence of this idea is that, just as there's only one interstellar environment, there is only one true way to live and only one correct political system. If civilization fails, It is just because sacred texts and theories have been misinterpreted. The texts themselves contain the way, and yet we should search for and find it. Another essential facet of Confucius's ideas was that mentors, and especially rulers, should lead by example. They must be benevolent to win the love and respect of the populace and not do so by force, which is futile. They should also be models of thriftiness and high ethical upstanding. For this reason, Chinese education has typically favored the growing of moral perceptiveness rather than particular intellectual abilities. Further, under Confucian influence, Chinese politics principally focused on the intimacy of relationships rather than organizations. Mencius and Shunshu. Later, the thoughts of Confucius were farther developed and codified by two essential thinkers, Mencius, or Mengshu, and Shunshu, or Sun Tzu. Whilst both actually believed that man's sense of morality and justice split him from the other animals, Mencius expounded the belief that human nature is essentially good, though Shunshu, although not of an opposite position, was slightly more pessimistic about humanity, and he, because of this, worried the importance of education and routine to keep the people on the right moral track. Confucianism, for that reason, expounded the value of four virtues which all of us possess: altruism, Zhen; righteousness, Yi; observance of rights, Li; and moral knowledge, Te. A fifth was later added, faith, which nicely represented the five components in Chinese thought of earth, wood, fire, metal, and water. So, yes, the belief that there is a close link between the physical and moral spheres is highlighted. By stating that all men have such virtues, two ideas are consequent. Education must nurture and cultivate them, and all guys are equal. Within the four seas, all men are brothers. With suitable application, anyone can become a sage, Sheng. It is an inherent talent which is important, but one's will to mold one's character into the most virtuous possible. Legacy. Following his death in 479 BCE, Confucius was buried in his family's tomb in Chufu in Shandong, and over the following centuries his stature grew so that he ended up being the topic of worship in schools at the time of the Han Dynasty, 206 BCE to 220 CE, and temples were developed in his name at all administrative capitals at the time of the Tang Dynasty, 618 to 907 CE. Throughout the imperial period, a substantial knowledge of the fundamental texts of Confucianism was a necessity in order to pass the civil service selection evaluations. Informed people usually had a tablet of Confucius's works plainly showed in their houses, and sometimes also statues, usually seated and dressed in royal costume, to symbolize his status as the king without a throne. Picture prints were also popular, particularly those taken from the lost original attributed to Wu Daoxi, or Wu Caozi, and made in the 8th century CE. Sadly, no modern portrait of Confucius survives, but he is usually portrayed as a sensible old man with long gray hair and mustaches, sometimes carrying scrolls. The theories of Confucius and his followers have then been an important part of Chinese education for centuries, and the impact of Confucianism is still noticeable today in modern Chinese civilization, with its ongoing focus on family relationships and respect, the significance of routines, the value given to restraint and ceremonies, and the strong belief in the power and advantages of education. Chapter 2. Aristotle. Aristotle of Stagira, lived 384 to 322 BCE, was a Greek theorist who originated organized clinical examination in actually each area of human knowledge, and was known in his time as the man who knew every little thing, and later simply as the philosopher, needing no further credentials as his fame was so prevalent. He actually created the idea of metaphysics solitarily when he or one of his scribes positioned his book on abstract philosophical speculation after his book on physics. Metaphysics literally means after physics, and standardized in learning how information is collected taken in and analyzed and then communicated across many disciplines. At the time of the later Middle Ages, circa 1300 to 1500 CE, he was referred to as the Master, most significantly in Dante's Inferno, where the author didn't really need to even recognize Aristotle by name for him to be acknowledged. This particular epithet is apt in that Aristotle wrote on and was considered a master in disciplines as diverse as biology, politics, metaphysics, farming, literature, botany, medication, mathematics, physics, principles, logic, and the theater. He is generally linked in series with Socrates and Plato in the triad of the three biggest Greek philosophers. Plato, lived circa 428 to 348 BCE, was a pupil of Socrates, who lived circa 469 or 470 to 399 BCE, and Aristotle studied under Plato. The student and teacher disagreed on a fundamental aspect of Plato's philosophy, the insistence on a higher realm of forms which made unbiased reality possible on the earthly airplane, although contrary to the claims of some scholars this didn't trigger any rift between them. Aristotle would build upon Plato's theories to advance his own original idea, and though he declined Plato's theory of forms, he never disparaged his previous master's basic philosophy. He was worked with by Philip II, king of Macedon, reigned 359 to 336 BCE, as tutor for his son Alexander the Great, lived 356 to 323 BCE, and made such an impression on the youth that Alexander brought Aristotle's works with him on campaign and introduced his philosophy to the East when he dominated the Persian Empire. Through Alexander, Aristotle's works were spread out throughout the known world of the time, affecting other approaches and offering a foundation for the development of Jewish, Christian, and Muslim faith. Early life. Aristotle was born in 384 BCE in Stagira, Greece, on the border of Macedonia. His father, Nicomachus, was the court physician to the Macedonian king and died when Aristotle was 10 years old. His uncle presumed guardianship of the boy and saw to his education. Aristotle most likely hung around with the tutors at the Macedonian court as the child and nephew of Pallas' staff, but this is not known with certainty. When he was 18 years old, Aristotle was sent to Athens to study at Plato's academy, where he stayed for the next 20 years. He was an extraordinary student, finished early, and was awarded a position on the professors teaching rhetoric and discussion. It seems that Aristotle thought he would take over the academy after Plato's death, and when that position was given to Plato's nephew Speusippus, Aristotle left Athens to conduct experiments and research study on his own in the islands of the Greek island chain. Aristotle and Alexander the Great. In 343 BCE, Aristotle was summoned by King Philip II of Macedon to tutor his child Alexander and held this post for the next 7 years, till Alexander ascended to the throne in 336 BCE and started his well-known conquests. By 335 BCE, Aristotle had gone back to Athens, but the two men remained in contact through letters, and Aristotle's influence on the conqueror can be seen in the latter's skillful and diplomatic handling of hard political problems throughout his career. Alexander's practice of carrying books with him on campaign and his wide reading have been credited to Aristotle's influence, as has Alexander's appreciation for art and culture. Aristotle, who held a low viewpoint of non-Greek barbarians generally and Persians particularly, encouraged Alexander's conquest of their empire. Similar to most, if not all, Greeks, Aristotle would have been brought up hearing stories of the Battle of Marathon of 490 BCE, the Persian invasion of 480 BCE, and the Greek triumph over the Persian forces at Salamis and Plataea. His advocacy of conquest, then, is hardly unexpected, considering the cultural environment he grew up in, which had remained mainly anti-Persian. Even without this consideration, Aristotle was philosophically pro-war on the grounds that it provided opportunity for greatness and the application of a person's personal excellence to practical, difficult situations. Aristotle believed that the final purpose for human existence was joy, eudaimonia, actually to be had of a great spirit, and this joy could be realized by keeping a virtuous life which developed someone's arete, personal excellence. An individual's arete would allow them to see what needed to be done in any given circumstance and be able to do it. Farther, by associating with virtuous comrades who sought the exact same end, the soul was enriched and an individual's excellence sharpened and honed, and warfare provided many opportunities for an individual to broaden on and prove not only self-worth, but achievement. He would have motivated Alexander with thoughts along these lines prior to the launch of the project in 336 BCE. Beliefs and distinctions with Plato. And when Aristotle went back to Athens in 335 BCE, he set up his own school, the Lyceum, a rival to Plato's academy. Aristotle was a teleologist, an individual who believes in end causes and last purposes in life, and actually believed that everything and everybody in the world had a function for existing, and, further, these final purposes could be ascertained from observation of the recognized world. Plato, who also handled first causes and final purposes, considered them more idealistically and believed they could be understood through apprehension of a greater undetectable aircraft of truth he called the world of forms. Plato's philosophy was deeply rooted in the mysticism of the Pythagorean school, established by the pre-Socratic philosopher and mystic Pythagoras, lived circa 571 to circa 497 BCE. Pythagoras highlighted the immortality of the soul and the significance of virtuous living, acknowledging there are essential, indisputable truths in life which one must recognize and stick to in order to live a good life. Plato was also considerably influenced by another pre-Socratic thinker, the sophist Protagoras, lived circa 485 to 415 BCE, considered the first relativist thinker. Protagoras notoriously kept that of all things a guy is the step, which means that individual perception figures out truth. There can be no unbiased truth in any given circumstance, Protagoras argued, because all discernible phenomenon or emotional or psychological experiences are subject to a person's analysis. Plato developed his theory of forms in an effort to refute Protagoras and supply his Pythagorean-infused idealism with a reasonable basis by which he could establish the existence of objective truth. The realm of forms contained the perfect expressions of what was good, true, and beautiful. All that was perceived by human beings on the earthly aircraft and described as good or true or stunning were only so insofar as they took part in the higher, more perfect form of good, or real or gorgeous. For example, a horse was not stunning simply because one appreciated how it looked. It was lovely objectively through involvement in the form of prettiness. Aristotle could never accept Plato's theory of forms, nor did he believe in presuming the unseen as a clarification for the discernible world when one could work from what one could see backwards towards a first cause. In his Physics and Metaphysics, Aristotle claims the first cause in the whole universe is the prime mover, that which moves all else but is itself unmoved. To Aristotle, this made more sense than the world of forms. To Aristotle, a horse is stunning because of certain characteristics humans connect with the principle of beauty. The horse's coat is a pleasing color. It is in good health. It has good form in the ring. To declare that a horse is gorgeous just because of some hidden and unprovable realm of perfect charm was untenable to Aristotle, just because any claim should require evidence so as to be accepted. The existence of the prime mover could be shown, at least in theory, because some force had to have set life in motion at some point in the past, and this force, whatever it consisted of, he designated the unmoved mover or prime mover. His reasoning in this would later be adopted by Jewish, Christian, and Muslim theologians and added to these faiths' idea of God. In rejecting the theory of forms, Aristotle mentions Plato and how he dislikes to refute his former teacher, a man who remains dear to him. He feels he must deal with the impracticality of Plato's theory, though, and encourages Platonists to abandon it, writing, "In the interest of truth, one should maybe think a man, specifically if he is a thinker, had better give up even theories that once were his own, and in fact must do so. It is our holy duty to honor truth more highly than good friends. That is Plato. Plato said that intellectual concepts of the truth could not be acquired from experience, and absolutely nothing could actually be learned. He most notably demonstrates this in his dialogue of the Meno, where he says that all learning is actually recalling from a previous life. Aristotle rejected this claim, arguing that knowledge was clearly learned simply because people could be taught, and this was evident in changes in their perception of life and conduct. An excellent man was good, Aristotle argued, simply because he had been taught the value of living a great virtuous life. If a person could not actually learn but only remember important truths from a past life in which they were good, then that individual could not be considered good themselves. The virtue a human displayed in life was the outcome of that person choosing to behave a certain way and practicing virtuous practices for their own sake, not for credibility or praise from others. Aristotle wrote, "Honor appears to depend on those that provide it, instead of on him who receives it, though our guess is that the good is a guy's own possession which cannot easily be removed from him." Aristotle advocated small amounts in all things so as to attain this good in life, which ultimately was a joy no individual or set of situations could take or diminish. Aristotle preserved that a guy becomes just by carrying out just acts and self-regulated by carrying out acts of self-control. Nicomachean Ethics 1, 1105b, 10. This self-discipline was exemplified by his principle of the golden mean. Aristotle writes, "In regard to pleasures and discomforts, the mean is self-control, and the excess is debauchery. In taking and giving cash, the mean is kindness, the excess and deficiency are overindulgence and stinginess. In these vices, excess and shortage work in opposite ways. An extravagant man surpasses in spending and lacks taking, while a stingy man surpasses in taking and lacks spending." Nicomachean Ethics 1, 1107b, 5-10. The golden mean offers a control which acts to correct one's conduct. If one knows that one is susceptible to the excess of overindulgence, one should revert to the severe reverse of stinginess. Since one's natural inclination will be to spend easily, making a mindful effort to spend absolutely nothing will lead to one drifting to the moderate ground between the extremes. The golden mean was amongst the number of precepts Aristotle taught to his students at the Lyceum. His practice of walking backward and forward as he taught made the Lyceum the name of the peripatetic school, from the Greek word for walking around, peripatetikos. Aristotle's favorite student at the school was Theophrastus, who would prosper him as leader of the school and who gathered and published his works. Some experts have claimed, in fact, that what exists today of Aristotle's work was never written to be published, but was only lecture notes for classes, which Theophrastus and others appreciated a great deal, and so had copied and distributed. Famous contributions and works. The golden mean is one of Aristotle's best-known contributions to philosophical thought after the prime mover, but it should be noted that this was only in the world of principles, and Aristotle contributed to each branch of knowledge available in his time. In ethics, he also famously explored the distinction between voluntary actions and uncontrolled actions, motivating people to try to fill their lives with as many voluntary actions as possible to accomplish the greatest happiness. He understood that there were many tasks and responsibilities one would meet in a day, which one would rather refrain from doing, but suggested one consider these apparent annoyances as chances and opportunities to happiness. For example, one may not want to do the dishes and would consider needing to perform this task an uncontrolled action. Aristotle would suggest one look at cleaning up the dishes as a way to the preferable end of having a clean cooking area and clean plates to use at the next meal. The same would apply to a job one doesn't like. Instead of seeing the job as an obstacle to happiness, one should look at it as the means by which one is able to buy groceries, outfits, take trips, and enjoy pastimes. The value of positive thinking and the value of gratitude have been highlighted by certain authors in different disciplines in the 20th and 21st centuries CE, but Aristotle was a much earlier proponent of the same view. In his work On the Soul, Aristotle deals with the issue of memory as fact, claiming that one's memories are impressions but not reputable records of what actually took place. A memory assumes a much different value as one goes through new experiences, and so somebody's memory of an unpleasant event, say a car mishap, will change if, because of that automobile mishap, one met the love of someone's life. People pick and choose what they will remember, and how they will remember it, based upon the emotional story they are telling themselves and others. This idea has been explored since Freud and Jung in the mid-20th century CE, but wasn't an initial idea of either of them. His Politics addresses the issues of the state, which Aristotle views as an organic development natural to any community of people. The state isn't a fixed structure forced on people, but a vibrant, living entity created by those that then live under its guidelines. Long before Thomas Hobbes wrote his Leviathan concerning the burden of government, or Jean-Jacques Rousseau developed his Social Agreement, Aristotle had already addressed their same concerns. Aristotle's Poetics introduced concepts such as mimesis, replica of reality in art, and catharsis, a purging of strong feeling, to literary criticism as well as the creative arts. His observations on poetic and rhetorical form would continue to be taught as objective facts on the subject up through the period of the European Renaissance. Aristotle was naturally curious about all elements of the human condition and natural world and methodically studied whatever subject came to his attention, discovered it to his satisfaction, and after that tried to make it comprehensible and significant through philosophical interpretation. Through this process, he developed the scientific method in an early form by forming a hypothesis and after that evaluating it through an experiment which could be repeated for the same results. After the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BCE, when the tide of Athenian popular viewpoint turned against Macedon, Aristotle was charged with impiety owing to his earlier association with Alexander and the Macedonian court. With the unjustified execution of Socrates in mind, Aristotle chose to leave Athens, lest the Athenians sin twice against philosophy, as he said. He died of natural causes a year later in 322 BCE. Aristotle's works, like Plato's, have influenced essentially every opportunity of human knowledge for the past 2,000 years. Though he was not commonly read in the West after the fall of Rome, his works were appreciated in the East, where Muslim experts drew inspiration and understanding from his works. His Nicomachean Ethics, written for his child Nicomachus as a guide to good living, is still sought advice from as a philosophical example in the study of ethics. He added to the understanding of physics, created the field and the research study of what is known as metaphysics, wrote extensively on life sciences and politics, and his Poetics remains a classic of literary criticism. In all this, he proved himself to be the master recognized by Dante. Just like Plato, Aristotle's work instills the whole spectrum of human knowledge as it is apprehended in the present day. Most scholars, thinkers, and thinkers over the past 2,000 years have argued with, dismissed, disregarded, questioned, and even exposed Aristotle's theories, but none have reasoned that his influence wasn't large and deeply permeating, establishing schools of idea, and creating disciplines taken for granted in the present as having always just existed. Chapter 3. Lao Tzu. Lao Tzu lived circa 500 BCE, also referred to as Lao Tzu or Lao Tzu, was a Chinese thinker credited with establishing the philosophical system of Taoism. He is best known as the author of the Lao Tzu, later retitled the Tao Te Ching, translated as The Way of Virtue, or the Classic of the Way and Virtue, the work which exhibits his thought. The name by which he's understood isn't an individual name, but an honorific title meaning old man or old master, and the argument continues regarding whether an individual by that name ever existed, or whether Lao Tzu is an amalgam of various thinkers. The historian Will Durant comments, Lao Tzu, greatest of the pre-Confucian theorists, was smarter than Teng Shi. He knew the knowledge of silence and lived, we could be sure, to a ripe aging, though we are unsure that he lived at all. Durant expresses the scholarly agreement on the historicity of Lao Tzu in that he could be a fictitious character created to embody the concept of the sage. Meanwhile, according to Chinese tradition, he was an actual historical figure, and in religious Taoism, he's understood as a deity. If he did exist, he's thought to have resided in the 6th century BCE. According to legend, Lao Tzu tried his best to advise people in the way of the Tao, the creative and binding force which runs through the whole universe. But nobody would listen. His clarification that people could live happier, more fulfilling lives by aligning themselves with the natural flow of the Tao, rather than putting themselves in opposition to it, went unheeded, and finally, he chose to leave mankind behind and retire into privacy after writing the Tao Te Ching. Legends concerning Lao Tzu also claim he was the modern and instructor of Confucius, lived 551 to 479 BCE, founder of Confucianism, which in its original form was closer to Taoism. Modern-day Lone dismisses this claim, and also Lao Tzu as the author of the Tao Te Ching, maintaining the work was more than likely created by several authors under the name Lao Tzu. Whenever it was written or by whom, its worth was acknowledged at the time of the Han Dynasty, 202 BCE to 220 CE, and its track record grew afterwards to notify the culture of the Great Tang Dynasty, 618 to 907 CE. Today it is considered as a classic of Chinese philosophical religious literature and has affected millions of people all over the world. Lao Tzu and Taoism. All that's understood of Lao Tzu comes from the timeless work records of the Grand Historian by the Han Dynasty writer Sima Qian, lived 145 or 135 to 86 BCE. Sima, working from older historic and literary files, claims that Lao Tzu was one of the managers at the Royal Library in the state of Chu and was referred to as a thinker. He promoted a deep connective empathy between people as the means to peace and harmony, and said that such empathy was possible through recognition of the galactic force of the Tao, which had created all things, bound all things, moved all things, and finally loosed all things back into their original state. Aligning a person's self with the Tao, according to Lao Tzu, brought one into harmony with the entire universe and enriched one's life. Opposition to the Tao only brought frustration, unhappiness, and anger, which led to bad conduct. He was especially intrigued by transforming the ruling class to his belief because the country was at this time in the midst of the period known as the Warring States period, circa 481 to 221 BCE, throughout which 7 states combated one another almost constantly for supremacy and control of the Chinese government. The Zhou dynasty, 1046 to 256 BCE, was in decline and could not do anything to maintain order, simply because the separate states were all more powerful than the federal government, but evenly matched against each other. The wars continued and different schools of Chinese philosophy were developed which tried to suggest the best way to end the violence and establish a moral government that would care for its citizens. Lao Tzu, according to Sima Qian, continued his efforts to convince people to accept the Tao and live a life in harmony with one another and the vast universe. And when he finally understood they never would listen to him, he abandoned human civilization for self-exile. On his way out of China, by way of the Western Pass, the gatekeeper, Yin Si, acknowledged him and asked him to please jot down his philosophy before leaving humanity behind. Lao Tzu took the materials from Yin Si, wrote till he had absolutely nothing left to say, handed the document to him, and walked through the pass, never ever to be seen again. Yin Si, presumably, then had the manuscript published. It is unlikely that any of this ever happened, however, because Taoism, in more or less the same way it is uttered in the Tao Te Ching, developed at the time of the Shang Dynasty, circa 1600 to 1046 BCE, from the exact same folk belief and understanding which produced the I Ching, a book of divination, which was informed by the concept of the principles of yin and yang. Scholar John M. Kohler remarks, Yin-Yang idea began as an attempt to answer the question of the beginning of the entire universe. According to Yin-Yang thought, the entire universe happened as a result of the interactions between the two primitive opposing forces of yin and yang. Just because things are experienced as changing, as procedures entering into being and passing out of being, they should have both yang, or being, and yin, or absence of being. The world of changing things that makes up nature can exist only when there are both yang and yin. Without yang, absolutely nothing can come into existence. Without yin, nothing can pass out of existence. This principle was later adapted by the polymath Zhou Yan, lived 305 to 240 BCE, who founded the Yin-Yang school, one of the many consisting of Taoism, which are acknowledged from the period known as the 100 Schools of Idea from the Spring and Autumn period, circa 772 to 476 BCE, and Warring States period. It could be said that Zhou Yan took the concepts of the yin-yang from Lao Tzu, but this is unlikely as it appears clear it existed centuries prior to his presumed existence. Further, the same fundamental principle of dualistic forces in constant movement notified the concept of Tian, paradise, as acknowledged by the philosophies of Confucianism and Mohism, among others. Nevertheless, custom still maintains that Lao Tzu is the author of the Tao Te Ching and that the work represents his last words to humanity. The Tao Te Ching. The Tao Te Ching is an anti-authoritarian treatise which presumes that the way of virtue depends upon non-action, wu wei, through an acknowledgement of the natural universal force referred to as the Tao. The Tao flows without effort and, like water, goes where it will without making each effort and impacts change and development. To be virtuous, one should emulate the Tao and take part in non-action, not requiring an effect or outcome. Human-made laws, it claims, cannot make one virtuous and can't contribute to etiquette, inner peace, or empathy with others simply because they're not in tune with nature. It's only by acknowledging the Tao and a person's connection to it in all things that one might attain these objectives. To recognize the Tao, one should know what it is, and so it is described in the first chapter. The Tao that can be told of isn't the everlasting Tao. The name that can be called isn't the everlasting name. The nameless is the origin of heaven and earth. The called is the mom of all things. Thus, let there always be non-being, so we might see their subtlety. And let there always be being, so we could see their result. The two are the same. But after they are produced, they have different names. The verse here is relating the intangible idea of being and non-being, of yin and yang, of the continuous dynamic movement of the vast universe which keeps creation in balance. That which actually is cannot be comprehended by the human mind, and so that which can be understood is what's named, and this is the Tao. It is not the actual Tao, but it points the way toward the Tao. One can't grasp the real Tao through intellectual pursuits, but rather by submitting to and expressing its essence in one's life, through self-reflection and unified interaction with others. Rulers, particularly, are motivated to embrace the Tao, since by their example their subjects will do likewise. According to the Tao Te Ching, the best ruler is one who leads so effortlessly that it appears he has not done anything, and yet everything has been done. Verse 17. The best person is the one that can recognize the current of existence and move with it, as effortlessly as water flowing, without upset or resistance, as in the well-known passage, yield and overcome, bend and end up being straight, empty and end up being full. This verse has turned into one of the most iconic in that it distills the message of Taoism concerning inner peace, accord with others, and personal success in 3 lines. Yield and get rid of. One cannot completely listen to another individual's views if one is full of a person's own. Accepting another motivates personal development. Bend and become straight. One can't reach an accord with someone else if one is unwilling to compromise, and one cannot fix bad conduct if one is not able to accept criticism. Empty and end up being full. One has little hope of success in any enterprise or relationship if one hold on to what one thinks one knows rather than opening oneself to new ideas and other views. Verse 22 reveals the heart of the Taoist message that when one is in positioning with the natural flow of energies of our universe, one has the ability to live more easily with somebody's self and others through non-resistance or non-action. One does not resist other individuals' views or new ideas, but flows with them, again like water, getting and carrying what is helpful and discarding what's not, what is too heavy to be carried. Lao Tzu's Taoism, or at least the Taoism of the 6th century BCE, emphasized the importance of non-action, non-resistance, going with the flow, to live a raised and transformative life. In so doing, it refuted Confucius's philosophy and its insistence on education, knowledge as power, and rigorous adherence to social custom-made and routine in improving someone's character and lifestyle. Lao Tzu's claim, paraphrased, that the more rules one makes, the more lawbreakers one creates, is the antithesis of Confucius's assertion that adherence to routine enhances one's moral character and produces better residents. Taoism and Confucianism. Even so, the two systems have much in common. As noted, legends claim that Lao Tzu was Confucius's coach and instructor, which suggests an early association between the two viewpoints. Whether Lao Tzu-Confucius claim has been challenged and mostly dismissed, the two systems share a number of similarities, which are typically overlooked in favor of highlighting their differences. The 100 schools of thought produced various approaches which competed for followers, and amongst them, 3 ended up being most popular: Confucianism, Taoism, and legalism, all 3 of which would be influenced by the other schools of thought and each other, and would go on to considerably inform Chinese culture. Of them all, legalism was the most the same and would always remain a social philosophy based on the understanding that people were innately selfish and self-indulgent, and necessary rigorous laws and standards to restrain their negative impulses. Confucianism and Taoism, on the other hand, both developed and started with the recognition of some higher power. They are regarded as philosophies and also religious beliefs, as they both include esoteric speculation and rely upon a greater unseen force to validate their claims. In Confucianism, this power is Tian. In Taoism, it is the Tao. But both of these ideas are informed by the yin-yang principle of the continuous flux of the vast universe. Taoism, which advocated adherence to the universal Tao long before the Tao Te Ching, was practiced through forefather worship and an acknowledgement of the natural law of the Tao in all things, which made it possible for personal and community balance. Confucianism, which also acknowledged the significance of forefather praise as part of filial piety, acknowledged Tian as the stabilizing force of the universe, which encouraged the same. The distinction between the two related to the emphasis on routine and social custom. Taoism, formally at least, repudiated these practices. Confucianism embraced them. According to Taoism, all people are naturally good but are corrupted by unjust law and an incorrect belief in how they're supposed to behave in society. By attempting to control people's behavior through the law, the government only intensifies their behavior because it produces a synthetic environment which human beings rebel against in an effort to maintain their natural state of harmony. If rulers acknowledge the Tao and align themselves with the flow of the energy of the whole universe, they would enact laws in accord with natural rhythms, and their subjects would react with respect and appropriate behavior. Confucianism says the exact same thing, but within a different paradigm. Tian is the managing force of the universe, which people who are basically good react to, but because they lack appropriate education and guidance, fall brief of becoming their best selves. Through education and observance of routine and social customized, one lined up somebody's self with the order of the whole universe, and acknowledged the value of respect for someone's self, others, and authority. In this way, Confucius said, people would naturally behave well, appreciating both themselves and others. Lao Tzu kept, as did the sophist Teng Shi, lived circa 500 BCE, that people behaved badly because they were pushed to through poor federal government and unfair laws. Confucianism said the same thing, and in fact, both Confucius and the later Confucian sage Mencius, lived 372 to 289 BCE, went to the different warring states to try to convince them to adopt policies of morality, virtue, and peace. The two systems, whose distinctions are typically extremely contrasted, shared much in common but diverged, again formally at least, when it came to formal education and knowledge. Knowledge was among the central values of Confucianism expressed, to cite only one example, in Analects 7:2. To get knowledge silently, to learn without losing interest, to instruct others relentlessly. while Taoism turned down formal education and book knowledge in favor of natural intelligence. Abandon learning and there will be no sadness. Verse 20.1. By this, Taoism was not dismissing knowledge per se, only formal education, and the value put on the social standing associated with it. Confucianism and Taoism, as well as the other systems articulated by the 100 schools of idea, were banned when the Warring States period ended in the success of the state of Qin and the facility of the Qin dynasty, 221 to 206 BCE. Between 213 to 210 BCE, all books, other than those on Qin history, legalism, and practical steps, were burned, and experts were executed. The only reason some texts survived was simply because they were hidden by people who comprehended their value. After the Qin dynasty fell, the Han dynasty restored these works and they were again distributed. Confucianism became the state philosophy under the reign of the Han Emperor Wu the Great, 141 to 87 CE, but by that time, the systems of Confucianism and Taoism had taken in principles from other schools, so their formulation by the time of the Han was probably different from their early visions. Confucianism, by this time, had been reformed by Mencius and Shunzhu, lived about 310 to about 235 BCE, and was far more developed than the form conceived by Confucius. By the time Taoism was adopted as the state philosophy by the Tang dynasty, 618 to 907 CE, it had also developed and was an even more rigid system than uttered by the Tao Te Ching. Observing routines the work itself would have dismissed as unneeded. At this same time, Taoism was also considered a faith with Lao Tzu as one of its deities amongst many others. In the present day, Taoism is recognized as a philosophy, a religious belief, and in one aspect a pop culture phenomenon. Its concept of a universal current flowing through and binding all things functioned as the motivation for the Force in the Star Wars franchise, and the image of the Taoist sage Lao Tzu, and the ones that followed him, notified the paradigm of the Jedi Knights. Whether there ever was a Lao Tzu who wrote the Tao Te Ching before cutting ties with humankind hardly matters anymore. The philosophy he may or could not have founded has long ago handled a life of its own and continues to develop as it brings in more followers captivated by the vision it presents of a life lived in accord with the natural world instead of one which resists it. Chapter 4. Zeno of Citium. Zeno of Citium, circa 336 to 265 BCE, was the creator of the Stoic school of philosophy in Athens, which taught that the logos, universal factor, was the greatest good in life, and living in accordance with reason was the purpose of human life. If one lived according to the impulse of impulse and enthusiasm, one was no more than an animal. If one lived in accordance with universal reason, one was truly a human being living a worthwhile existence. This philosophy would later be developed by Epictetus, 50 to 130 CE, and others, and would have a great influence on the people of Rome, most significantly the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, 121 to 180 CE. Stoicism would eventually end up into one of the most popular and prominent approaches in the Roman world. Zeno was born in the Phoenician Greek city of Citium on Cyprus in the exact same year that Alexander the Great ascended to the throne of Macedonia. His father was a merchant who traveled typically to Athens, and Zeno naturally took up his father's occupation. It is unclear whether Zeno studied philosophy in his youth, but, around the age of 22, while stranded in Athens after a shipwreck, he picked up a copy of Xenophon's Memorabilia and was so impressed by the figure of Socrates that he abandoned his previous life and made the study of philosophy his only interest. Zeno studied under Crates of Thebes and then under Stilpo the Megarian, and after that ended up being the pupil of Polemo. From each of these men he learned some different element and subtlety of the life of a thinker. From Stilpo, for example, it is said he learned that the greatest fault in life lay in saying yes too rapidly to any request, and one needs to keep away from doing so to live a peaceful life. In this, he predates Sartre's assertion that saying no is an assertion of someone's individuality, while consenting to another's demand diminishes the individual character. After many years of study, Zeno set up his own school and began to teach on the dex, the stoa, of the game in the marketplace in Athens, and so his school took the name of the place of learning, Stoic. It is alleged that Zeno said, "I made a thriving trip when I was shipwrecked," and by this he meant that just before his coming to Athens his life had no meaning. The discipline of philosophy gave Zeno a focus he seems to have done not have as a merchant, and he devoted himself to study and, more importantly, to living the values he absorbed from his mentors and the books he read. Professor Forrest E. Baird writes that Zeno argued that virtue, not satisfaction, was the only good, and that natural law, not the random swerving of atoms, was the essential principle of the whole universe. 505. He was praised highly by the Athenians for his temperance, his consistency in living what he taught, and his good impact on the youth of the city. Zeno never seems to have been one to hold his tongue when he saw what he perceived as foolishness in the youths around him, and lots of his comments sound comparable in tone to declarations Diogenes of Sinope would have made. Unlike the mad Socrates of the Agora, as Diogenes was known, Zeno lived a life of conventional, Athenian respectability, while refusing to compromise his principles for what civilization valued. It was clear to Zeno that most of the people of Athens suffered simply because they desired what they did not have or feared losing what they loved. The pursuit of enjoyment, as embraced by the Epicureans' philosophy, which sprang from the Cyrenaic school of Aristippus, could never ever possibly satisfy a person, because one would always be chasing after what one preferred or attempting to hold on to what one had already gotten. Rather than satisfaction, one should court reason and recognize that all things are impermanent and without lasting value. Once one understood this, one would accomplish a state of enlightened apathy in which one would be released from enslavement to somebody's passions. Mautner, 607. This belief is what made the Stoic school so popular to the Greeks of the time and later to the Romans. Zeno's theories cleared the mind and permitted one to see past what one thinks one wants, to recognize all that one actually needs, which is simply the self. If one is self-aware, one is also knowledgeable about others and, further, recognizes that it is in simpleness that true satisfaction may be found. Those teachings, of course, are more popular today as the basic tenets of Buddhism. Diogenes Laertius, writing in the 3rd century CE, protected some of Zeno's teachings in his work Lives and Opinions of Eminent Philosophers. He writes that Zeno said, "As for the assertion made by some people that satisfaction is the object to which the first impulse of animals is directed, it is revealed by the Stoics to be false. For pleasure, if it is truly felt, they declare to be a spin-off, which never ever comes until nature by itself has looked for and found the means ideal to the animal's existence or constitution. It is an aftermath equivalent to the condition of animals thriving and plants in full flower. And nature, they say, made no distinction originally between plants and animals, for she manages the life of plants too, in their case without impulse and feeling, just as also certain processes go on of a vegetative kind in us. However, when in the case of animals impulse has been superadded, whereby they're allowed to go in quest of their correct element, for them, say the Stoics, nature's rule is to follow the direction of impulse. However, when reason by way of a more flawless leadership has been bestowed on the beings we call rational, for them life according to reason rightly becomes the natural life, for reason supervenes to shape impulse clinically." In this, Zeno is just saying that animals pursue pleasure simply because they are governed by impulse which drives them to impulse. But people, since they have been given reason, ought to be governed by rational thought and live fairly. To chase after satisfaction as the meaning of life, and think that one is living well, is to be no greater than an animal, or as Shakespeare later expresses it in Hamlet, "What is a man, if his chief good and market of his time be but to sleep and feed? A monster, no more. Sure he that made us with such large discourse, looking before and after, gave us not that capability and godlike reason to fust in us unused." Act 4, Scene 4, 33-39. To be a true person, one needed to behave like a real human being, reasonably. When he studied under Crates of Thebes, Zeno wrote his Republic, which is rather a completely different vision of the best society than the ideal city-state as envisioned by Plato in his work of the same name. Zeno's Republic is a paradise whose residents declare our universe as their home and where everyone lives in accordance with natural laws and rational understanding. Males and females were entirely equal in society's eyes, and there was no oppression because all actions proceeded from reason. There were no laws necessary just because there was no criminal activity, and just because everybody's needs were looked after in the exact same way that animals are in nature, there was no greed, nor covetousness, nor hatred of any kind. Love governed all things, and everyone living in this cosmopolis comprehended they had what they wanted and needs for nothing more. It's thought that this vision was largely influenced by Crates' life and that of his marriage partner Hipparchia of Marnia, who survived on completely equal terms with him, wore guys' outfits, and taught philosophy to men. Crates and Hipparchia lived their lives in accordance with the simplicity of reason, and Zeno's vision in his Republic shows that view. Of Zeno's work, Plutarch later wrote, "It is actually true indeed that the so much admired Republic of Zeno, first author of the Stoic sect, aims singly at this, that neither in cities nor in the areas we should live under laws distinct one from another, but that we should look upon all people in general to be our fellow countryfolk and people, observing one way of living and one kind of order, like a flock feeding together with equal right in one typical pasture." This Zeno wrote, fancying to himself, as in a dream, a specific scheme of civil order and the image of a philosophical commonwealth. Zeno lived and taught in Athens from the time he arrived there following his shipwreck until his death. He passed away, obviously from suicide, after he tripped coming out of school and broke his toe. Lying on the ground, he quoted a line from the Niobe of Timotheus, "I come of my own accord. Why call me therefore?" And then, interpreting the accident as a sign he should depart, strangled himself. While this could seem an unusual end to the life of a man who preached the primacy of reason, it wouldn't have seemed so to him. When some happy period of someone's life ends, it is illogical to hold on to the past and dream it would return. Absolutely nothing can make that time come again, and yearning for an impossible past only robs one of the present. Zeno was an old man when he's said to have broken his toe, and realizing that he had lived a very good and meaningful life in Athens, he could have simply concluded that it was time for him to carry on to something else. This has been Philosophy, Confucius, Aristotle, Lao Tzu, and Zeno. Written by Philip Rivaldi. Narrated by Doug Green. Philosophy. Diogenes, Heraclitus, Marcus Aurelius, and Parmenides. Written by Philip Rivaldi. Narrated by Doug Green. Chapter 1. Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius Antoninus reigned 161 to 180 CE, last of the good emperors of the Roman Empire, has been hailed as the noblest of all the men who, by large intelligence and force of character, have treasured and attained goodness for its own sake and not for any benefit. Grant, 139. His reign was identified by a commitment to his people, and this and his enduring philosophical work, Meditations, attest to the truth of Grant's appreciation. Scholar Michael Grant, though, is barely the first to show such beliefs. Aurelius was highly appreciated in his lifetime and is referred to as the thinker by later old sources like Cassius Dio, circa 155 to 235 CE, and the author or authors of the Historia Augusta, 4th century CE, a history of Roman emperors. It is clear from both these sources that Aurelius's Meditations was known to them, but the authors focus not only on the written work, which Aurelius never ever meant for publication, but on how he lived his philosophy throughout his reign. The Meditations is Aurelius's journal, written between circa 170 and 180 CE when he was on army projects in Germania, and expresses his philosophical, especially Stoic view of life. The work is a private reflection on how to live the best life possible. It isn't a sleek philosophical tract, and repeats some themes throughout its 12 books, as Aurelius faces the same serious questions at different times. Scholar Gregory Hayes elaborates. The questions that the Meditations tries to answer are primarily metaphysical and moral ones. Why are we here? How should we live our lives? How can we ensure that we do what is right? How can we safeguard ourselves against the stresses and pressures of life? How should we deal with pain and bad luck? How can we live with the knowledge that sooner or later we will no longer exist? His Meditations has influenced many people through the centuries, but in the present day, he is probably best known for his representation in well-known Hollywood movies like Gladiator, 2000 CE. While his depiction in Gladiator is rather fictionalized, particularly concerning his cause of death and his vision for Rome, that he must be played so sympathetically in the film is a testament to his tradition. Whatever creative license the film might have taken with the facts of Aurelius's life, the spirit of the man comes through as a close approximation to Plato's principle of the theorist king articulated in Book 5 of the Republic. Plato writes, "Unless either thinkers end up being kings in their nations, or the ones that are now called kings and rulers happen sufficiently influenced with a real desire for wisdom, unless, that is to say, political power and philosophy meet together, there can be no rest from problems." Aurelius himself would never ever have thought to compare himself favorably with Plato's vision, nor with the ideal of a Roman emperor as embodied by his honorable predecessor Antoninus Pius, reigned 138 to 161 CE, who adopted him as successor. He saw himself as a student of philosophy, not as a theorist, and as a guy having a hard time to satisfy his obligations to the people who trusted him, not as an emperor. It is specifically his modest view of himself which makes him the ideal candidate as the philosopher king. Plato's principle stipulates that specifically the man who enjoys knowledge more than power, who is best suited to rule. Antoninus Pius adopted and groomed Aurelius as a Roman emperor, but it is crystal clear that the boy would have preferred the life of the theorist. In his Meditations, he returns continuously to the theme of the significance of living a real, truthful life in the attempt to find inner peace, rather than pay attention to the features of power and the sort of duties intrinsic in ruling an empire. Youth and Introduction to Philosophy. Aurelius was born in Spain in 121 CE to an aristocratic Roman family which was politically connected. He was named after his dad, Marcus Annius Verus, who had been named for his dad and his father's dad, who were senators. His mother, Domitia Lucilla, circa 155 to 161 CE, was also a rich patrician and well-connected politically. At the age of 3, following the death of his dad in circa 124 CE, Aurelius was brought up mostly by his grandfathers and nurses. When he was 11 years old, he was introduced to philosophical thought by one of his mentors, Diognetus, and internalized the discipline which would direct him throughout the rest of his life. In his Meditations, Aurelius thanks Diognetus for the lessons he learned and notes them. Not to waste time on rubbish. Not to be taken in by conjurers and hoodoo artists with their discussed necromancies and exorcism and all the rest of it. Not to be obsessed with quail fighting or other fads like that. To hear unwelcome realities. To practice philosophy. To write conversations as a student. To choose the Greek living style, the camp bed and the cloak. Aurelius's reference to the camp bed and the cloak suggests the Cynic school of philosophy as the first to have a major effect on him. The Cynic school was founded by Antisthenes of Athens, lived circa 445 to 365 BCE, a student of Socrates, lived circa 469 or 470 to 399 BCE, and its theories were later exemplified in the lives of Diogenes of Sinope, lived circa 404 to 323 BCE, and Crates of Thebes, lived circa 360 to 280 BCE. The Cynic thinkers, and Plato, would impact Zeno of Citium, lived circa 336 to 265 BCE, who founded the Stoic school of philosophy, which would come to have a profound effect on Aurelius's life and idea later. The skeptic school was characterized by the discipline of self-denial, which rejected high ends, social status, and wealth in addition to unnecessary material things. By freeing an individual's self on all non-essentials, consisting of social conventions of polite good manners and correct conduct, one would be free to go after simply being a person's self. Aurelius seems to have found this sort of life appealing and went after it by picking the Greek style, as he calls it, and sleeping on the ground or the floor of his room rather than his bed, and adopting the simple woolen cape of the theorist. If he fully embraced cynicism, he would have also renounced any luxurious possessions, satisfied himself with the most basic food, and declined fundamental health as an expression of vanity. His immersion in this lifestyle, though, was reduced by his mom relatively quickly, who felt he must pursue goals more in keeping with the family name and their status in society. His mom and grandpas worked with tutors to train the boy, and no expense was spared. Historian Will Durant remarks, "Never ever was a boy so persistently educated," and continues, 4 grammarians, 4 rhetors, 1 jurist, and 8 theorists divided his soul among them. He was connected in boyhood to the service of temples and priests, 425. His early education also included the services of the highly respected orators and rhetoricians Herodes Atticus, lived circa 101 to 177 CE, and Marcus Cornelius Fronto, died late 160s CE, who would both apply considerable impact over the boy. Aurelius and Fronto would become lifelong friends. Adoption and Stoicism. In 138 CE, Antoninus adopted Aurelius and his future co-emperor Lucius Verus, reigned 161 to 169 CE, as successors as stated by his predecessor Hadrian, reigned 117 to 138 CE. Aurelius at this time took the name Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, and was betrothed to Antoninus's daughter Faustina. Antoninus then began a mindful grooming of the young man as future emperor, and this included not only obligations at court but more education by tutors. Aurelius dutifully adhered to his adopted father's dreams but found his new life unfulfilling. In his letters to Fronto, still extant, he complains about his boring lessons in law, his secretarial duties, and his life at court. He also reveals these feelings in one of his more famous lines from Meditations. "The important things you think about identify the quality of your mind. Your soul takes on the color of your thoughts. Color it with a run of thoughts like these. Anywhere you can lead your life, you can lead a very good one. Lives are led at court, so then good ones can be." Fronto had tried to dissuade his pupil from philosophical pursuits, feeling they were a time waster, and directed him to what he saw as more practical disciplines. Aurelius had always been predisposed to philosophy, however, and his fixation with introspective thought on the meaning of any given action, and life in general, would continue throughout his life. Fronto was dissatisfied then when he learned that included in his former pupil's education at court he would be tutored in philosophy, but this news must have been a great relief to Aurelius himself. Antoninus hired 2 theorists who would greatly impress Aurelius, and whose theories would inform the rest of the boy's life. Apollonius of Chalcedon, dates unknown, and Quintus Junius Rusticus, circa 100 to 170 EC, one of the greatest Stoic philosophers of his day. These tutors instructed him in Stoicism, the philosophical school first articulated by Zeno of Citium but totally uttered in the writings of Epictetus, lived circa 50 to 130 CE, in his Discourses and Enchiridion. Stoicism held that there was an everlasting binding force to our universe, called the Logo Designs, from which all things came. The Logos infused every little thing, bound it together, and allowed it to dissipate all in its own great time, according to nature. There was absolutely nothing in life, therefore, which could be called bad just because all discernible and unobservable events streamed naturally from the Logo Designs, and judgments on whether an experience was bad or good were simply short-term sense perceptions of the person. An individual could lead a serene, harmonious life if that person concentrated on the nature of the logos and regulated a person's sense impressions. Epictetus writes, "It is not situations themselves that trouble people, but their judgments about those scenarios. For example, death is nothing terrible, for if it were, it would have appeared so to Socrates. But having the opinion that death is horrible, this is what is terrible. For this reason, when we are impeded or bothered or distressed, let us never ever blame others, but ourselves, that is, our own judgments." In his Meditations, Aurelius thanks Apollonius and Rusticus for their guideline and notes that Rusticus introduced him to the work of Epictetus, lending him his own copy, Meditations 1:7. The Stoic view ended up being Aurelius's view from this point on, and he reveals this in another of the best-known passages from Meditations. "If it is good to you, O universe, it is good to me. Your harmony is mine. Whatever time you choose is the right time. Not late, not early. What the turn of your seasons brings me falls like ripe fruit. All things are born from you, exist in you, return to you." In 161 CE, Antoninus passed away and Aurelius ended up being emperor. The Senate chose to ignore Hadrian's desire that Verus should co-rule with him as they thought him unsuited for office. Aurelius, however, reminded them that Antoninus had promised his predecessor to adopt both himself and Verus as successors, and refused to handle the mantle of power unless Verus was called co-emperor. The Senate had no choice but to comply. The Theorist King. Verus was more youthful than Aurelius, and even more fascinated by pursuing pleasure than the tasks of an emperor. He threw lavish and costly parties and gave luxuriant gifts to his guests. Aurelius, on the other hand, continued to live as he always had, simply and without pretension. He took his responsibilities seriously, even if he didn't always look after them, and dedicated all his energies to making certain his choices were just. Cassius Dio writes, "The emperor, much as he had leisure from war, would hold court. He used to allow plentiful time to the speakers and participated in the preliminary queries and assessments at great length, so as to ensure stringent justice by each possible means. In consequence, he would usually be attempting the exact same case for as much as 11 or 12 days, even though he at times held court at night. For he was industrious and applied himself diligently to all the responsibilities of his office, and he neither said, wrote, nor did anything just as if it were a small matter, but at times he would consume entire days over the minutest point, not thinking it right that the emperor should do anything hurriedly, for he believed that if he must minor even the tiniest detail, this would bring reproach upon all his other actions. Quickly after coming to power, the province of Syria revolted and the kingdom of Parthia attacked Armenia, which was under Rome's security. When Cassius Dio notes how Aurelius performed his responsibilities when he had leisure from war, he's referencing very little time, certainly. But Aurelius was pressed by other matters as well, both public and personal. Throughout the 19 years of his reign, Aurelius would be constantly harassed by bloody military projects, natural disasters, and domestic sadness. Of the 5 sons Faustina bore him, only one, Commodus, reigned 177 to 192 CE, survived to adulthood. Aurelius had only been emperor about 1 year when the river Tiber flooded in 162 CE, damaging crops and livestock, resulting in prevalent starvation. When Verus went back to Rome from his military projects against Parthia and the Syrian rebels, his soldiers brought the plague epidemic back with them. Verus, in fact, would die of the plague epidemic in 169 CE, leaving Aurelius to rule alone. The new sect of Christianity constantly interrupted the peace, and Aurelius was pushed to take part in persecutions of this spiritual faction to restore order between about 162 and about 166 CE. The tribes of the Marcomanni and Quadi began invading the frontiers in circa 166 CE, and Aurelius spent untold hours and resources trying to secure and maintain the limits and also broaden Rome's area into the Danube area as a buffer. Though Plato assures an end to problems once a theorist ends up being king, Aurelius had no end of problems throughout his reign. Even so, as history and his own writings testify, Aurelius did his best to stay steady in the face of difficulties, displaying what Hemingway would later call grace under pressure, the ability to stay steady and true to somebody's self no matter the situation. The choices Aurelius made during his reign give evidence of a kind, caring, disciplined soul who positioned a high value on commitment to a person's true self and to others. His insistence on honoring guarantees and promoting custom, however, sometimes led him into mistake, as seen when he refused to rule unless Hadrian's wishes were honored and Verus ruled with him. Verus showed a vastly inferior emperor to Aurelius in each respect. His choice of Commodus as his co-ruler and inheritor in 177 CE, however, was his greatest error in that his son never shared his high ideal visions nor showed his intelligence. That Commodus would essentially undo all of the good that Aurelius had done, turning over the rule of Rome to incompetence and entertaining himself continuously in his seraglio, which presumably was comprised of 300 girls and 300 boys, shows exactly how poor Aurelius's judgment could be. Aurelius appears to have noticed that his child would never gauge up to the potential he saw in him, and when he passed away in 180 CE, Commodus would prove himself the worst choice possible as heir. Yet it is this very humanness, this compassion and hope for others to share his exact same vision, to become the best version of themselves, and this makes Aurelius so admirable, and the Meditations so enduring. The work stands as a testimony to the nobility of its author and endures because of the tremendous functionality and sense of the vision for life it reveals. There is no room for self-pity or self-excuse in the pages of Meditations, only the continuous exhortation to do somebody's best under any circumstance and to use somebody's time sensibly, for life is brief. He writes, "You must one day recognize at last of what universes you are a part and from what ruler of the universes your existence comes, and that a limit of time has been set aside for you, and if you do not use it to clear away the clouds from your mind, it will be gone, and you'll be gone, and it will never ever return again." Aurelius understood that if one wants to change the world, one cannot live the way the remainder of the world does. Even at the height of his power, he never ever betrayed his philosophical vision or his belief in a fundamental meaning to human life. He expresses this ideal in Meditations, Book 8:59. People exist for the purpose of one another. Teach them, then, or bear with them. In this passage, as in many others, Aurelius prefigures the much later ideal visions of the 20th century CE existentialists, who also held that the purpose of one's life is to be the best human being one can be, regardless of the circumstances or the actions of others. In the meantime, of course, he embodies the earlier idea of Plato's theorist king, the man who rules not for himself, but for the greater good of his people. Chapter 2. Hipparchia the Cynic. Hipparchia was the marriage partner of Crates, an incredibly popular Athenian philosopher. She was also notable for her brazen desertion of her aristocratic upbringing for life as a skeptic. Despite the fact that not that much is known a lot about Hipparchia, her significance in the history of ancient Greek women is undeniable. She was an educated theorist, she was outspoken, and she was non-traditional. Hipparchia was from an upper-class family from Maronea, in northeastern Greece, and just because she lived in the somewhat more relaxed Hellenistic period, she was managed a basic education in subjects like reading and music. This knowledge would give her the ammunition to stand on her own intellectually later in her life. In an effort to rebel against her elite background, Hipparchia started keeping company with Crates and began to follow his theories of the Cynic school of philosophy. She fell in love with him, and despite his efforts to turn her away, at her parents' or caretaker's wish, he eventually gave in to her. When Crates chose to take Hipparchia as his partner, a convention that wasn't popular amongst the Cynics, he made her promise to turn her back on her family, desert all conventions, and be his intellectual equal in living the Cynic lifestyle. Naturally, she agreed. When Hipparchia wed Crates, she gladly began to follow the Cynic lifestyle. Skeptics were non-traditional thinkers who were more individually focused than worried about the greater good. Cynics eschewed materialism and the conventions of society and marriage, including where marriage was consummated, at the very least for Hipparchia and Crates, and were known for their stunning behaviors and shamelessness when it came to showing their philosophical views. As skeptics, Hipparchia and Crates were quite the team. When they weren't performing unspeakable acts in public spots, they actually made rather sturdy contributions to civilization, which may seem a bit contradictory to the philosophy. They counseled struggling people, and even consoled the ill and bereaved. They were also known for participating in many supper parties, where Hipparchia typically participated in arguments with the male guests, who were usually irritated with her audacity. Hipparchia was the mother of 2 children, whom she no doubt raised in the non-material ways of the Cynic lifestyle. She was also a writer, and wrote several books on cynicism and harangues against other philosophies. Due to the unpopularity of her philosophical school, and the fact that she was a female pursuing a primarily male pursuit, her writings were not maintained. Her tradition, though, is preserved in the few references of the ancient writers and philosophers who pleased to mention her name. There's no doubt, though, that Hipparchia must have stuck out amongst the Greek women of her time, for good or for bad. Chapter 3. Heraclitus of Ephesus. Heraclitus of Ephesus, circa 500 BCE, was known to his contemporaries as the Dark Theorist, so called because his works were so tough to understand. Appearing to hold the common comprehension of the nature of life and the purpose of human life in contempt, as in fact he appeared to hold most, if not all, the people he came in contact with, Heraclitus compared many people's comprehending to that of those sleeping. To Heraclitus, only the thinker, the one who pursued truth, was completely awake and fully alive, and he seemed to consider himself the only theorist of his time. Provocation and obscurity. His works, which so puzzled the many, seem purposefully written to push a reader to independent thought and awareness, much like the Zen koans of the East, rather than supplying them with more of the exact same sleep-inducing philosophies of life Heraclitus so hated. Scorning the relatively simple approach of his predecessors, such as Anaximander, Anaximenes, and Xenophanes, he regularly insisted on a determined obfuscation of his meaning. While this is usually comprehended as an effort to inform his readers, it could as quickly be analyzed as simply a reflection of his individual character, as it is reported by age-old writers that he brought about his own death by speaking with the physicians in this same willfully confusing manner. Life is flux. Following in the traditions of the earlier pre-Socratic philosophers, Heraclitus expounded a physical theory of matter and the real world, much along the lines of Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes, but took the ideas further in his famous assertion that life is flux, panta rei in Greek, meaning everything or all things change. If one understands that change is the only constant in life, then one will more quickly recognize what Heraclitus is saying in his odd writings when he claims such things as, "The way up and the way down are one and the same. Living and dead, waking and sleeping, young and old, are the exact same. These things are the exact same in that they're all subject to change, show up from one change to disappear into another, and all things constantly are in flux and are, in that regard, the exact same." Heraclitus was well known amongst his contemporaries for his undisguised contempt for all of them, and similarly the ones who preceded them. Among the over 100 pieces we have of his work is this one which claims, "An understanding of many things does not teach one to have intelligence. Otherwise it would have taught Hesiod and Pythagoras, or again, Xenophanes and Hecataeus." DK 22b40. Discussing this, Professor J.M. Robinson writes, "To know many things, to know the causes of thunder and lightning and earthquakes, is good, but it is better to comprehend the just one thing which underlies all of these, the idea that guides all things through all things. This is knowledge." Robinson, 88. The hidden form of life, the wisdom Heraclitus understood, is that the human condition is primarily defined by strife, by the coming together and retreating of opposing forces. While people lament this strife, relating it with suffering, Heraclitus observed that this exact same process notified the natural world, also writing, "All things come into being through opposition, and all are in flux like a river." DK 22A1. There's no reason, then, to fear or try to stay away from strife, just because dispute is the essential underlying force in life. Heraclitus's world order, Logos. This competing of forces, which Heraclitus defined as fire, is easily noticeable in nature, and yet people withstand the natural movement of life and try to hold on to what's known and what's considered safe. Heraclitus claimed that this clinging is unnatural and is what triggers people to suffer. He writes, "This world order, the exact same for all, no god made or any man, but it always was and is and will be an ever-living fire, kindling by step and going out by procedure." DK 22B30. The world order is continual change, and resistance to this change is a kind of death, in that the individual is refusing to participate in that which specifies life. Though it appears he would never admit to it, Heraclitus appears to have developed the ideas of Xenophanes concerning a single eternal God who is behind all things and who set all in motion. He called this force the brandings. In Greek, logos means the word, but also means to speak, and can also refer to conveying thought, and the logo designs of Heraclitus may most neatly fit the latter meaning. The logos constantly conveys thought to human beings, but the message is really missed because of the consistent refusal of people to recognize the natural order in their own lives. Heraclitus writes, "Though the logos is as I have said, guys always fail to comprehend it, both before they hear it and when they hear it for the first time. For though all things enter into remaining in accordance with this logo designs, they appear like guys without experiences, though in fact they do have experience both of words and deeds, such as I have set forth, distinguishing everything in accordance with its nature and declaring what it is. But other guys are as unaware of what they do when awake as they are when they are asleep." The branding is reasonable, natural, universal thought, through which the universe came into existence and by which it is maintained. In this respect, Heraclitus's beliefs correspond with those of the younger theorist Parmenides, who claimed that all of existence was one, was of the exact same precise compound, and could never ever be created or ruined. Heraclitus's brandings would correspond to Parmenides' one, with the difference that the logos informs all things but isn't those things themselves. Parmenides disagreed with Heraclitus's claim that all was strife and the everlasting clash of forces, firmly insisting that all such observations were based upon incorrect sensory analysis. Heraclitus, though, would claim that Parmenides' argument was flawed in that the operation of the logos is just the natural order of life, and a comprehension of it isn't dependent on the senses, but on reason. He writes, "They don't comprehend how. Though the branding is at difference with itself, it agrees with itself. It's a harmony of opposed tensions, as in the bow and the lyre." DK 22B51. And, further, in opposition there's agreement, between unlikes, the fairest consistency. DK 22B8. And, the hidden harmony is stronger than the obvious. DK 22B54. This hidden harmony is the fundamental stuff of existence which, when properly collared, makes life both reasonable and significant. The later thinker, Zeno of Citium, would develop this idea into the school of thought referred to as Stoic philosophy, which would farther be developed by the Stoic thinker Epictetus, to name a few, to become the dominant pressure of philosophical idea in Rome. Death. Diogenes Laertius, circa 200 CE, in the 8th book of his famous Lives and Opinions of Eminent Theorists, relates the death of Heraclitus and how it was in keeping with his life. When somebody asked Heraclitus to decree some guidelines, he revealed no interest because the government of the city was already bad. Instead, he went to the temple of Artemis and played dice with kids. Finally, he became misanthrope, withdrew from the world, and lived in the mountains feeding upon yards and plants. Though, having fallen in that way into dropsy, he came down to town and asked the medical professionals in a riddle if they could make a drought out of rainy weather. When they did not comprehend, he buried himself in a cow stall, expecting that the dropsy would be evaporated by the heat of the manure, but nevertheless he couldn't affect anything and ended his life at the age of 60. The dropsy Heraclitus struggled with would today be referred to as edema, a swelling of soft tissue because of a buildup of fluid underneath the skin. It was typical of Heraclitus to pose his issue to the doctors in a riddle, as it seemed he was always checking others in the belief that he had above-average intelligence. When they couldn't comprehend his request that they make a drought out of rainy weather to mean he was experiencing dropsy, he, also generally, chose he knew best how to cure himself. Scholars put his death at about 475 BCE. Besides the Stoic school, Heraclitus's idea would significantly influence others who followed him, and his riddles are often quoted and mentioned in Plato's dialogues and, later, in the works of Aristotle. He has regularly been mentioned as among the most brilliant, if difficult, of the pre-Socratic philosophers, and his significance in manufacturing the human experience with the natural world continues to be acknowledged today. Chapter 4. Diogenes of Sinope. Diogenes of Sinope, circa 404 to 323 BCE, was a Greek cynic philosopher best well known for holding a lantern or candlelight to the faces of the residents of Athens, claiming he was searching for a sincere man. He was most likely a student of the theorist Antisthenes, 445 to 365 BCE, and, in the words of Plato, apparently, was a Socrates freaked. He was driven into exile from his native city of Sinope for ruining currency, though some sources say it was his dad who committed the criminal offense, and Diogenes simply followed him into exile. Diogenes' beliefs. Diogenes came to Athens, where he met Antisthenes, who at first refused him as a student, but ultimately was used down by his persistence and accepted him. Like Antisthenes, Diogenes had faith in self-discipline, the importance of personal quality in somebody's behavior, in Greek, arete, typically translated as virtue, and the rejection of all which was considered unnecessary in life, such as personal possessions and social status. He was so ardent in his beliefs that he lived them extremely publicly in the marketplace of Athens. He took up residence in a pretty large white wine cask. Some sources claim it was an abandoned tub, owned absolutely nothing, and seems to have lived off the charity of others. He owned a cup which served also as a bowl for food, but threw it away when he saw a boy drinking water from his hands and realized one did not even need a cup to sustain oneself. This much can be said with more or less assurance, but any other details end up being increasingly unpredictable owing to the many fables which grew up around Diogenes and his time in Athens. Even the claim that he was Antisthenes' student has been challenged as a fable. It seems clear, though, that Diogenes really believed what people called manners were simply lies used to hide the true nature of the individual. He was known for harsh sincerity in conversation, neglected any sort of etiquette regarding social class, and seems to have had no problem urinating in public, and, when criticized, pointed out that such activities were regular and that everyone participated in them but hid in personal what he did freely. According to Diogenes, society was an artificial contrivance set up by human beings which did not accord well with truth or virtue and could not in any way make a person a pretty good human being. And so follows the well-known story of Diogenes holding the light up to the faces of passers-by in the marketplace looking for a sincere man or a real human. Everyone, he claimed, was trapped in this make-believe world which they really believed was reality, and because of this, people were living in a type of dream state. He was not the first theorist to make this claim. Heraclitus, Xenophanes, and most notoriously, Socrates all pointed out the need for human beings to wake from their dream state to full awareness of themselves and the world. Plato's well-known allegory of the cave is devoted to this very theme. Diogenes, however, challenged the citizens of Athens daily with their lifelessness and shallow values, emulating his hero Socrates, whom he never ever met but would have learned of from Antisthenes. Though it seems lots of people thought he was simply mentally ill, Diogenes would have said he was living a completely honest life, and others should have the courage to do the same. Plato and Alexander the Great. This conduct of Diogenes was notified in part by the belief that if an act is not outrageous in personal, then it needs to not be outrageous in public. The rules by which people lived then were nonsensical in that they forced people to behave in a way different from how they would naturally have behaved. Manners and rules were both regarded by him as staples of the false life in the dream world and should not be delighted in. Accordingly, he insulted his social superiors frequently, and that includes Plato and Alexander the Great. When Plato defined a human being as a featherless biped, and was applauded for the cleverness of the definition, Diogenes plucked a chicken, brought it to Plato's academy, and announced, "Behold, Plato's human." Plato then added, "with broad, flat nails," to his meaning. This isn't the only time Diogenes insulted Plato openly, but is the best understood incident. When it comes to Alexander the Great, both Diogenes Laertius and Plutarch relate how, when Diogenes was living in Corinth, Alexander came to the city and was extremely intrigued by meeting the philosopher. He found Diogenes resting in the sunlight, introduced himself, and asked if there was anything he could do for him. Diogenes replied, "Yes, get out of my sunlight." Alexander admired his spirit and said, "If I were not Alexander, I would wish to be Diogenes," to which Diogenes responded, "If I were not Diogenes, I would also wish to be Diogenes." On another occasion, when some people were discussing a guy called Callisthenes and the fine treatment he got from Alexander, Diogenes said, "The man then is wretched, for he is forced to breakfast and dine when Alexander chooses." Another time, at a banquet for some Athenian elites, some of the guests threw Diogenes some bones and described him as a pet dog, so he lifted his leg and urinated on them. Despite or just because of his outrageous behavior, the Athenians loved him, and as Laertius relates, when a young boy broke Diogenes' cask, the people had the boy beaten and changed the broken cask. It is unlikely, however, that Diogenes cared very much for the cask or what state it was in. To him, possessions were a trap. To be really free and live a virtuous life of complete awareness was the supreme meaning of one's existence. As Diogenes Laertius writes, on one occasion he was asked what was the most excellent thing among men, and he said, freedom of speech. He was in the routine of doing everything in public, whether in respect of Venus or Ceres, and he used to put his conclusions in this way to people. If there's absolutely nothing unreasonable in dining, then it isn't ridiculous to dine in the marketplace. However, it isn't unreasonable to dine. For this reason, it isn't unreasonable to dine in the marketplace. This was in reference to the restriction on eating in the agora, the public market, which, like all such restrictions, Diogenes disregarded. Slavery and death. For Diogenes, a reasonable life is one resided in accordance with nature and with one's natural dispositions. To be true to oneself, then, no matter how mad one might appear, was to pursue a life worth living. Whether true or another myth, the tale of Diogenes' capture by pirates and his being sold into slavery in Corinth bears statement to the strength of his convictions. When asked what skill he had, he responded, that of governing guys, and then required to be sold to Zenyatus, saying, "Sell me to that man, for he wants a master," even though he was a servant at this moment, and in no position to need anything. He believed so entirely in himself that others felt compelled to listen to him and do what he said. Zenyatus, for instance, put Diogenes in charge of tutoring his young sons, and in time, the theorist became part of the family. He lived in Corinth with Zenyatus's family for the rest of his life and passed away there at the age of 90. His cause of death has been given as either extreme gastrointestinal disorder from eating a raw ox's foot, rabies from a dog bite, or suicide by holding his breath. The residents of Corinth, like those of Athens, had come to considerably admire the philosopher and buried him in honor by the city gate, putting up a monument over his tomb. This would have amused Diogenes, who, when asked what he wished finished with his body after his death, responded that it ought to be tossed outside the city for the dogs to feed on. A statue of him stands in modern-day Sinop, Turkey, portraying him holding out his lantern with a pet dog sitting by his side. Chapter 5. Parmenides. Parmenides, circa 485 BCE, of Elea, was a Greek theorist from the colony of Elea in southern Italy. He is called the creator of the Eleatic school of philosophy, which taught a rigorous monistic view of reality. Philosophical monism is the belief that all of the practical world is of one standard substance and being, uncreated and indestructible. According to the old writer Diogenes Laertius, circa 200 CE, Parmenides was a student of Xenophanes of Colophon, who some claim as the creator of the Eleatic school, but left his master's discipline to pursue his own vision. However, the stamp of Xenophanes' theories can be seen in the work of Parmenides in that both assert that the important things in life which one thinks one comprehends could be quite different than they appear to be, particularly concerning an understanding of the gods. Xenophon's insistence on a single deity who in no chance resembled human beings seems to have been the basis for Parmenides' claims of a single compound making up all of reality. Parmenides was a younger modern of Heraclitus, who said that all things are continuously moving and change, that the fundamental stuff of life is change itself. Parmenides' thought could not be more removed from that of Heraclitus in that Parmenides said nothing moved, change was an impossibility, and that human sense perception could not be trusted for an apprehension of truth. The philosopher of changeless being. According to Parmenides, there is a way which is and a way which is not, a way of fact or truth and a way of viewpoint about things, and one should come to an understanding of the way which is to understand the nature of life. Referred to as the theorist of changeless being, Parmenides' insistence on an eternal single truth and his repudiation of relativism and mutability would significantly influence the young theorist Plato and, through him, Aristotle, though the latter would interpret Parmenides' fact rather differently than his master did. Plato devoted a dialogue to the man, the Parmenides, in which Parmenides and his student Zeno come to Athens and instruct a young Socrates in philosophical knowledge. This is quite a tribute to the thought of Parmenides in that in most discussions Plato presents Socrates as the wise questioner who needs no guideline from anyone. While Parmenides was an older contemporary of Socrates, it is skeptical the two men ever met, and Plato's discussion is considered an idealized account of the thinker, though accurate in portraying his philosophy. Defense by Zeno. Zeno of Elea was Parmenides' most popular student and wrote 40 paradoxes in defense of Parmenides' claim that change and even movement were impressions which one must neglect so as to know the nature of oneself and that of the universe. Zeno's work was meant to clarify and protect Parmenides' statements such as, "There is not nor will there be anything aside from what is, since certainly destiny has fettered it to remain entire and immovable. For that reason those things which mortals have developed, believing them to be true, will be mere names, entering into being and doing, being and not being, change of place." Robinson, 116. In other words, Parmenides contends that we may think the world we live in is comprised of multiples, but in reality it is one. Nothing is capable of inherently changing in any substantial fashion just because the real substance of reality is unchangeable and nothingness can't be comprehended. Absolutely nothing can come from nothing. Nevertheless, it seems that Parmenides' ideas themselves were hard to comprehend for his listeners, necessitating Zeno's math paradoxes. Parmenides' bottom line, though, was just that nothing could come from absolutely nothing and that being should have always existed. He writes, "There is left but this single path to tell thee of, particularly that being is. And on this path there are many proofs that being was actually without starting and indestructible. It is universal, existing alone, unmovable, and without end. Nor ever was it, nor will it be, since it now is completely one and constant. For what generating of it wilt thou seek out? From what did it grow, and how? I won't allow thee to say or to believe that it originated from not being, for it is unrealistic to think or to say that not being is. What would then have stirred it into activity that it should emerge from not being later instead of earlier? So it is needed that being either is definitely or is not, nor will the force of the argument license that anything spring from being except being itself. For this reason justice doesn't slow her fetters to permit generation or destruction, but holds being firm. Being and not being. Basically, his argument is that since something can't come from absolutely nothing, then something must have always existed in order to produce the reasonable world. This world we perceive, then, is of one substance, that same compound from which it came, and we who populate it share in this exact same unity of compound. For this reason, if it should appear that an individual is born from absolutely nowhere, or that one dies and goes elsewhere, both of these perceptions must be wrong, because that which is now can never ever have been not, nor can it ever not be. In this, Parmenides may be developing ideas from the earlier theorist Pythagoras, circa 571 to circa 497 BCE, who said the soul is never ceasing and go back to the practical world consistently through reincarnation. If this is true, though, Parmenides really drastically departed from Pythagorean thought, which enables that there is plurality present in our reality. To Parmenides, and his disciples of the Eleatic school, such a claim would be proof of belief in the senses, which, they firmly insisted, could never ever be trusted to reveal the truth. The Eleatic concept that all is one and unvarying put in substantial impact on later philosophers and schools of thought. Besides Plato, who in addition to the dialogue Parmenides also dealt with Eleatic ideas in his conversations of the sophist and the statesman, the popular sophist Gorgias employed Eleatic reasoning and principles in his work, as Aristotle would also do later, mainly in his Metaphysics. This has been Philosophy, Diogenes, Heraclitus, Marcus Aurelius, and Parmenides. Written by Philip Rivaldi. Narrated by Doug Green. Philosophy. Eastern versus Western Philosophy Explained. Written by Philip Rivaldi. Narrated by Doug Green. Chapter 1. Pythagoras. Pythagoras, circa 571 to circa 497 BCE, was a Greek theorist whose theories highlighted the immortality and transmigration of the soul, reincarnation, virtuous, humane conduct toward all living things, and the principle of number as truth, in that mathematics not only cleared the mind, but permitted an unbiased comprehension of reality. He is best known in the modern for the Pythagorean theorem, a mathematical formula which states that the square of the hypotenuse of a best triangle amounts to the sum of the squares on the other two sides. This formula has been applied to measuring distance and space as, for instance, in planning and executing the building of a structure. While credited to Pythagoras by ancient authors, modern-day academics point out evidence from Babylonian texts written a bit of time before Pythagoras, which go over the same formula or, at least, one extremely similar. Practically nothing is known of Pythagoras' life, although later writers, such as Diogenes Laertius, 3rd century CE, tried to create biographies based upon stories and fragments from earlier works. Laertius's bio of Pythagoras is the most complete, but, unfortunately, the author never ever points out the sources he drew from, and so it is impossible to substantiate a lot of his claims. Pythagoras' influence on later philosophers and the development of Greek philosophy usually was enormous. Plato, lived circa 428 to 348 BCE, references Pythagoras in certain of his works, and Pythagorean thought, as comprehended and communicated by other age-old writers, is the underlying form of Plato's philosophy. Plato's famous student Aristotle, lived 384 to 322 BCE, also incorporated Pythagorean theories into his own thoughts, and Aristotle's works would affect philosophers, poets, and theologians, among many others, from his time through the Middle Ages, circa 476 to 1500 CE, and into the modern day. Though Pythagoras remains a mystical figure in antiquity, because of that, he also stands as one of the most substantial in the development of philosophical and religious thought. life, and functions. What is known of Pythagoras originates from later authors piecing together pieces of his life from contemporaries and students. It's understood that Pythagoras was born on the Isle of Samos off Asia Minor, where his ancestors had settled after leaving Phlius, a city in the northwest Peloponnese, after the civil war there in 380 BCE. He received a quality education, as his dad, Mnesarchus, was a wealthy merchant. He might have studied in Babylon and in Egypt, and possibly had the best Greek tutors of the time. All of this is speculative, however, as the info originates from later authors who accepted uncritically what others wrote about him. If there was a reliable biography of Pythagoras, or original works by the man himself, they're long lost. Scholar Forrest E. Baird remarks, Pythagoras was connected with so many legends that few experts dare to say much about his life, his character, or perhaps his theories, without adding that we cannot be sure our info is precise. That there was a guy called Pythagoras who founded the sect called the Pythagoreans we need not doubt. Among the witnesses to his historicity was his younger modern Heraclitus, who thought ill of him. However, it is infamously difficult to see the difference between the theories of Pythagoras himself and those of his followers, the Pythagoreans. The historicity of Pythagoras has never been questioned. Heraclitus lived circa 500 BCE, as Baird notes, considered Pythagoras highly overrated, and another modern, the visionary Xenophanes of Colophon, lived circa 570 to 478 BCE, buffooned Pythagoras for his belief in reincarnation. The trouble in any conversation of Pythagoras is in attempting to separate the actual man and his theories from the folklore which surrounded him even in his own lifetime. Pythagorean beliefs. As noted, none of Pythagoras' writings, if he wrote anything, have survived, and owing to the secrecy he required of his students, the specifics of his theories were carefully kept. The thinker Porphyry lived circa 234 to circa 305 CE, who wrote a later bio of Pythagoras, said, What he taught his disciples nobody can actually say for sure, for they maintained an impressive silence. All the same, the following ended up being normally known. First off, he said that the soul is never ceasing. Second, that it moves into other kinds of animals. Third, that the exact same events are repeated in cycles, nothing being new in the strict sense. And finally, that all things with souls should be considered as comparable. Pythagoras seems to have been the first to introduce these beliefs to Greece. The Greek historian Herodotus lived circa 484 to circa 425 or 413 BCE, alludes to Pythagoras, though famously refuses to name him in his histories. Moreover, the Egyptians are the first to have kept the doctrine that the soul of man is immortal and that when the body dies, it enters into another animal that is being born at the same time. And when it has been the complete round of the beings of the dry land and of the sea and of the air, it gets in again into the body of a man at birth, and its cycle is finished in 3,000 years. There are a number of Greeks who have adopted this doctrine, some in previous times and some in later, just as if it were their own invention. Their names I know but avoid documenting. Like the Pythagorean theorem, Pythagoras' idea of the transmigration of souls might also have been obtained. Scholar George G. M. James, in his work Stolen Tradition, The Egyptian Origins of Western Philosophy, says that all of the great pre-Socratic theorists either studied in Egypt or in the Egyptian mystery schools of Asia Minor. James 9. Thales lived circa 585 BCE, considered the first Western theorist, studied in Babylon, and two other of the most substantial pre-Socratics, Anaximander, lived circa 610 to circa 546 BCE, and Anaximenes lived circa 546 BCE, both traveled extensively and had access to the mystery schools which focused on Egyptian spiritual thought. It is more than likely, then, that Pythagoras' thought was actually Egyptian spirituality transplanted to Greece. Pythagoras' well-known secrecy might have been meant to keep this fact from distributing too commonly and discrediting him as an initial thinker. He is said to have been rather charismatic and a powerful speaker, and it would have undermined his authority if his philosophy was revealed as just repackaged Egyptian belief. Whether he concealed his theories for this particular reason or some other can't be determined. It's possible he just felt the masses would not comprehend or appreciate his ideas. Whatever the reason, the secrecy added significantly to his mystique and reputation. His belief in the immortality of the soul and reincarnation led naturally to a vegetarian lifestyle with a focus on doing no harm to any other living thing, and this asceticism, which he also required of his followers, elevated his reputation as a holy man even further. Diogenes Laertius defines his diet and practices. Some say that he was gratified with honey alone or a bit of honeycomb or bread. He did not touch red wine throughout the day, or for a treat, vegetables boiled or raw. Seafood he ate but seldom. His bathrobe, which was white and clean, and his bedclothes, which were also white, were of wool, for linen had not yet reached those parts. He was never ever observed to relieve himself, or to make love, or to be intoxicated. He used to avoid laughter, and all catering scurrilous jokes and repulsive stories. Laertius defines Pythagoras as a pescatarian, eating fish and seafood, but most other age-old authors maintain he was a rigorous vegetarian, abstaining from the meat of any living thing which could be considered having a soul. He likewise abstained from sex and remained celibate to maintain spiritual power and clarity of thought. In disengaging from worldly pleasures like sex and food, he released himself from the diversions of the body to concentrate on the enhancement of the soul. This asceticism was thought by some to go too far. He and his followers were known to specifically abstain from eating and even touching beans. One account of his death, in fact, claims that he wouldn't go into a bean field to get away from pursuers and so was killed. Laertius also discusses Xenophanes' satirical criticism of Pythagoras' belief in the transmigration of living souls. Once they say that he, Pythagoras, was walking by when a young puppy was being whipped, and he took pity and said, "Stop, do not beat it, for it is the soul of a good friend that I acknowledged when I heard it giving tongue." To Xenophanes, who rejected reincarnation, Pythagoras' beliefs were as silly as claiming one could recognize a left good friend's voice in the bark of a pet dog. To Pythagoras, though, vegetarianism, pacifism, and humane treatment of other living things were all part of the path to inner peace, and by extension, world peace, in that human beings could never ever live in harmony as long as they killed, ate, and were terrible to animals. Poor treatment of animals, and eating animal flesh, cheapened all life, by maintaining that some creatures, people, were worth more in life than others. Pythagoras actually believed that all beings were created in an equal way, and should be treated respectfully. He was considered by contemporaries and later writers as a mystic, not a mathematician as he is in some cases described in the present day, and his school was connected with spiritual redemption and amazing revelation. A central belief, which would significantly impact Plato, was that philosophic inquiry was important to the redemption of the soul and apprehension of supreme truth. An aspect of that truth was that nothing ever substantially changed, and all was everlasting and permanently repeating. According to the age-old author and student of Aristotle's, Eudemus of Rhodes, lived circa 370 to circa 300 BCE, Pythagoras had faith in eternal recurrence as a sensible mathematical necessity. Eudemus writes, "If one were to really believe the Pythagoreans, that events recur in an arithmetical cycle, and that I shall be speaking with you again sitting just as you are now with this pointer in my hand, and that everything else will be just as it is now, then it is believable to suppose that the time, too, will be the same as now." In this belief, Pythagoras prefigures the great German theorist Friedrich Nietzsche, lived 1844 to 1900 CE, and his theory of eternal recurrence, in which Nietzsche claims that in the lack of the finish line of a God who renders judgment after death, somebody's life will automatically reset and repeat itself in exactly the exact same way. Nietzsche's theory has typically been translated as a support to thoroughly consider how one spends an individual's time, since one will have to relive every event, large or small, permanently. This might have also been suggested by Pythagoras' theories. Even if Pythagoras himself did not frame the concept in this way, he must have articulated it somehow for later Pythagoreans to have repeated it. The principle of the cyclical nature of life and the immortality of the soul were at the heart of Pythagorean thought and affected many writers and thinkers of ancient Greece, but none as significant as Plato. Pythagoras and Plato. It is possible that Plato started as a student of Socrates, adhering to dialectic and establishing truth, and after that only gradually approached embracing the idealism of Pythagoras, as some experts have said, but it seems more possible that Socrates himself was lined up with Pythagorean thought. There is really no other way of developing any claim along these lines, since most of what we know of Socrates originates from Plato's dialogues, which were written after Socrates' death, when Plato was already of a mature philosophical mind. No matter how he was introduced to it, Pythagorean thought significantly affected Plato's philosophy, which included the idea of a supreme truth not subject to opinion, of a moral lifestyle in line with that truth, the soul's immortality, the need of salvation through philosophy, and of learning as recollection. Pythagorean ideas appear throughout Plato's work, but most notably in the dialogues of the Meno and Phaedo. In the Meno, Plato's primary character Socrates shows how what one calls learning is actually only remembering lessons from a past life. He shows his claim by having a young ignorant slave resolve a geometrical issue. Plato argues that if one passes away with an individual's mind undamaged, one will remember what one learned at the time of that life when one is born into the next. What one thinks one learns in this life, one is actually only remembering from an individual's past life, and what one knew in that past life was remembered from a former one. Plato never addresses the obvious problem with this idea. Eventually, the soul must have had to actually learn and not just remember. His claim that one remembers what one learned in the ether in between lives, not just in mortal form, does not address the concern because the soul still would need to learn at some time, whether in the body or out of it. Pythagoras' assertion that things are numbers and also that one could understand the physical world through mathematics also features in the Meno, not only through Socrates' interaction with the slave, but through his argument that virtue is a particular quality fundamental in all people, despite their age, sex, or social status, in the exact same way that number informs and defines the known world. One recognizes reality through a distinction between unity and duality. This claim would go toward the development of Plato's popular theory of forms, in which he describes an objective world of reality, above the mortal realm, which underlies and informs all human facts and provides their value of truthfulness. Without this realm of forms, Plato argued, there could be no actual truth, only viewpoint about what one felt was true. To Pythagoras, mathematics was the course toward enlightenment and understanding, and as he said, 10 is the very nature of number. And by this number he meant not only a unit of measurement, but a way by which the world could be comprehended and comprehended. He noted how people can count up to 10 on their fingers and, having actually reached 10, revert back to the one unit and begin again. In the same way, a soul entered a body, lived for a certain time, passed away, and reverted back to where it started from, only to then travel the same course again. This principle is checked out fully in Plato's Phaedo, the account of Socrates' last day in jail before his execution, which concentrates on the immortality of the soul and the afterlife. Right from the start of the discussion, Plato uses Pythagoras' link to Phlius, in selecting Echecrates of Phlius as interlocutor and audience to Phaedo the narrator. Further, the characters of Simmias and Cebes of Thebes, Socrates' main interlocutors in the account Phaedo relates, are both Pythagoreans. Plato's choice of Echecrates connects the discussion straight to Pythagorean thought from the first line, but, through Simmias and Cebes, Pythagorean ideas are introduced and developed throughout. Toward the end of the dialogue, after various evidence have been given by Socrates for the immortality of the soul, he concludes with this exchange with Cebes. "Tell me," Socrates said, "what is that which must be in the body to make it alive?" "A soul," Cebes responded. "And is this always so?" "Obviously," Cebes said. "Then the soul always brings life to whatever contains her?" "No doubt," Cebes answered. "And is there an opposite to life or not?" "Yes." What is it? Death. And we have already concurred that the soul cannot ever receive the opposite of what she brings? Yes, definitely we have, said Kevis. What do we call that which doesn't accept death? The never-ceasing, Kevis said. And the soul does not admit death? No. Then soul is never-ceasing. It is. Good, Socrates said. Shall we say that this is shown? What do you think? Phaedo, 105 C2E. The math evidence that Socrates offers earlier pertaining to even and unequal numbers eventually causes the above evidence that even cannot admit of the odd to stay itself even, and so life, the soul, cannot admit of death and still stay life. Therefore, the soul must be immortal. This whole argument epitomizes Pythagorean thought, as comprehended by age-old authors and practiced by Pythagorean sects of Plato's time. The Phaedo also establishes the geography of the afterlife, which would later be used by the Church in creating the ideas of hell, purgatory, and paradise. The concept of purgatory first appears in Phaedo 108 B to D, Judgment of the Dead in 113 D to E, Hell in 113 E to 114 A, and Paradise in 109 D to 110 B. Plato's argument for an ultimate, undeniable realm of truth from which all other truths are developed is also evident in the gospel stories of the Bible, most especially the Gospel of John, and in the epistles of St. Paul. Despite the fact that nothing can be said for certain regarding Pythagoras' life or original theories, enough of his thought was developed by later disciples and admirers to have affected the greatest Greek theorist of antiquity. Plato's work established the discipline of philosophy and has permeated each other to greater or lesser degrees for the past 2,000 years. The details of Pythagoras' life may never be fully understood, but his influence continues to be felt worldwide in the present day. Chapter 2. Moti. Moti lived 470 to 391 BCE, also called Motsu, Motsi, and Mishius, was a Chinese theorist of the Warring States period, circa 481 to 221 BCE, connected with the 100 schools of thought, different philosophical schools which established themselves in this period. He is the creator of Moism, also given as Moism, a philosophical system advancing the principle of consequentialism, one's actions specify one's character, and emphasizing universal love as the meaning of life and the solution to all dispute. Little is known by people of his life other than he was a carpenter and inventor of various devices, specifics unknown, and originated from the state of Lu, modern-day Shandong province, the same area as the thinker Confucius, lived 551 to 479 BCE, whose precepts Moti highly disagreed with, just as he declined the vision of Lao Tzu, lived circa 500 BCE, the famous and possibly mythical creator of Taoism. Moti's ability in woodworking made him an important asset to the Warring States in constructing quality siege ladders and fortifications. In an effort to level any state's advantage over another, he provided each with exactly the same benefit, not only in material products but technique and intelligence. He hoped by this stratagem to neutralize their efforts and bring them to a comprehension of the value of peace and futility of war, but his labors failed. Despite the fact that he was able to clearly make his point to some kings, none of them adopted his philosophy. He seems to have continued in spite of the evident futility of his mission, until he realized that none of the states were going to choose universal love over the pursuit of personal power. His devotion to the cause of peace was recognized and admired even by his harshest critic, the Confucian thinker Mencius, lived 372 to 289 BCE, and his philosophy did attract adherents, just not those he was wishing to convert. When the state of Qin finally beat the others and founded the Qin dynasty, 221 to 206 BCE, Moti's works, in addition to those of Confucius and Lao Tzu, were banned, and the philosophy of legalism embraced. Throughout the Han Dynasty, 202 BCE to 220 CE, Confucianism was adopted as the country philosophy, and Moism was forgotten until its revival in the 20th century CE. The Warring States and Mo-Ti. The Warring States period in China, circa 481 to 221 BCE, was the era in which 7 independent states combated each other for supreme control of the federal government. The Zhou dynasty, 1046 to 256 BCE, was still recognized as the judgment house from Luoyang, but in name only. They no longer had the power to impose any of their laws, nor perform any functions related to a strong and steady state. The Zhou dynasty developed itself as a decentralized federal government with separate states, almost self-governing, loyal to the Zhou king who had granted the lands. After some time, these states grew more effective than the king, and as royal authority decreased, each state started to contend with the others for supremacy. None could acquire the advantage, however, because each used the exact same methods and observed the same laws of chivalry and warfare. Mo-Ti was an extremely competent carpenter and craftsman who ended up being a specialist in building siege ladders and designing strongholds, and so was in high demand among the rulers of the 7 states in helping them beat each other. While at first it appears that Mo-Ti did design and build numerous gadgets and strongholds for the warring parties, he recognized that war was ridiculous and antithetical to the goodness of life, and started trying to maintain each state's ability for attack or defense at the exact same level so as to maintain balance between them. As noted, the states were already frustrated in trying to get an advantage over each other, and this led to their looking for Mo-Ti's help in supplying them with an edge. Instead, he farther leveled the playing field to impress upon them the futility of the continuous wars. He understood that the states were only fighting each other out of self-interest, not because they wanted to do any helpful for the people, and actually believed this kind of behavior was simply self-centered and basically unethical. The historian Will Durant remarks, Mo-Ti believed selfishness is the source of all evil, from the acquisitiveness of the child to the conquest of an empire, and marvels that a guy who takes a pig is widely condemned and generally penalized, while a man who invades and appropriates a kingdom is a hero to his people and a design to posterity. Mo-Ti dedicated himself to travel between the warring states in an effort to convince the rulers to embrace love and pacifism. One of the best-known examples of his technique is when he headed to the state of Chu to stop their ruler, Ganshu Restriction, from attacking the state of Sung. Mo-Ti ably beat Ganshu Restriction in a series of dry runs and then informed Ganshu that he had already provided Sung with help in fortifications and technique, and so an attack would be futile. Ganshu Ban then cancelled his attack. Moism. Although through episodes like this, Mo-Ti seemed to make an impression on a ruler and was able to save lives, his successes appear to have been few. Still, though his efforts were mostly unsuccessful and he was often mocked, this did not in any way deter him from his course. He had earlier set up a school in his native state of Lu, in which he trained students in woodworking and Chinese philosophy, and many of these students ended up being ardent disciples and helped him spread his message of universal love. Mo-Ti actually believed that love began close at hand with one's family and friends, but should by no way end there. He preached an objective love, whereby one would regard all people as members of a person's family. That teaching was at odds with the already popular Confucian principle of respect for a person's family and somebody's forefathers above all others. But Mo-Ti countered the criticism by mentioning that in his philosophy, one still needed to honor one's family and kin, but then deal with others in the exact same way. This belief formed the basis of Mo-Ti's ethics of consequentialism, in which a person's individual behavior, despite of prescribed ritual, dictates one's character and, by extension, the quality of the state. If one is kind and lives a unified existence, one will draw generosity and harmony to oneself, and alternatively, if one is contentious and spiteful, one will attract a like response from others. Simpleness in all things, and adherence to the concept of universal love, was at the heart of Moism. Mo-Ti writes, Men in general loving one another, the strong wouldn't make prey of the weak, the many wouldn't plunder the few, the rich would not insult the poor, the noble would not be insolent to the mean, and the sly wouldn't impose on the easy. Through love and sharing all things, he said, China would find peace and could leave the constant warfare which marked the world he knew. His philosophy acquired a groundswell of support but was slammed as being too idealistic and unwise. The theorist Mencius, the great supporter and codifier of Confucianism, condemned Moti's principle of universal love as subversive and required its suppression. He considered Moism as unsafe a belief system as the hedonism of the egoist philosopher Yang Zhu, lived 440 to 360 BCE, claiming that they weakened the authority of conventional understanding and practice and were intent on turning rational people into wild beasts. Scholar Arthur Whaley remarks, Mencius speaks of Mosu, who taught that all guys should really love each other no less than they loved themselves, as abolishing fatherhood solely just because dads lose in Mozu's system the unique position they keep in Confucianism, and simply because Yang Tzu held that each person needs to perfect himself spiritually and physically instead of sacrifice himself to the presumed good of the community. Mencius says that the followers of Yang Tzu abolish princehood, that's to say, do away with all governmental authority, and that Yang Tzu and Mozu both wish to reduce humanity to the level of wild beasts. Moti was actually arguing the contrary of Mencius's claim. By embracing universal love for all people, no matter their social class or relationship to someone's self, one was actually supporting the basic principles of true federal government, the look after and protection of the people, and the spirit of Confucianism in enhancing a person's ethical character and conduct. Nevertheless, Moti's vision did oppose Confucian persistence on the value of routine and appropriate conduct in establishing good character, and also refuted the Taoist claim that one need only align an individual self with the intergalactic Tao to find inner peace. Dispute with Confucianism and Taoism. The Confucian idea of character, initially glance, seems in line with Moti's consequentialism. Behavior specifies the individual. But the substantial difference is that Moti claims that one's behavior is a reflection of personal spiritual work, while Confucius keeps it as the result of following exact rituals in a specific manner. Confucius actually believed that correct behavior motivated good character. If one behaved well in accordance with accepted custom made, one would become a really good person. Moti maintained that observing ritual and custom could not make a person good. One had to dedicate someone's self to personal spiritual work, subjugating self-interest for the good of others, in order to be considered a great person. Moti also disagreed with the Taoist vision of a galactic force, the Tao, which notifies and binds all things together. Moti's philosophy would also seem to line up with elements of Taoism in the belief that there is a natural flow to human existence, which, once one comprehends and acknowledges it, encourages a more tranquil and harmonious relationship with the world, oneself, and other people. But, in Taoism, this is the Tao. In Moism, it is universal love. One could see the results of embracing universal love in an individual's behavior, Moti noted, while one could not in saying one was living in accord with an undetectable force. Scholar John M. Kohler comments, Moti argued that the way to enhance the human condition was to tend to the instant well-being of the people. The slogan of the Moists was, "Promote general welfare and get rid of evil." The requirement promoted for measuring how good anything is was its effectiveness in accomplishing human happiness. Eventually, according to Moism, value was to be measured in terms of benefits to the people. Benefits, in turn, could be measured in regard to increased wealth, population, and contentment. Moti kept that only through reflection, self-study, and sincere conduct which was true to someone's self and the principle of universal love could one become good, not through adherence to ritual and conformity, and not through connection with some undetectable force which streamed through all of existence. He contended that what benefited humanity was quickly apprehended through empirical observation. One could recognize good through its effects on people, just as one could understand what was bad through negative responses and suffering. Moti and ghosts. Moti's philosophy was obviously declined by the Confucians and Taoists, and its approval wasn't helped by his widely known belief in the existence of ghosts who walked among and could engage with the living on a daily basis, which ran counter to the accepted comprehension of the dead as existing in another realm or appearing only when bothered, although he argued his beliefs on rational grounds. He reasoned that, When people tell of how a specific device runs with which one isn't acquainted, or of how certain people behave or speak in a land one has never been to, one should accept what's said if their report seems reliable and if they themselves have shown trustworthy in the past. Following this line of thinking, one should accept what's said about ghosts if those that tell about them can be relied on what they have said about other subjects. As old historic accounts as well as contemporary reports included recommendations to ghosts interacting with the living, they should be accepted as a reality in the exact same way one recognized established history and news reports of the day, even if one has not experienced a ghost oneself. Farther, he claimed, even if ghosts do not exist as reported, the communal routines involved in honoring, appeasing, or safeguarding an individual's self from them would offer occasions to gather our loved ones and neighbors and participate in the pleasure of the sacrificial victuals and beverages. These events would offer the opportunity for people to show love for each other and the departed, and would bind the community more closely. Still, his arguments were not met with success, since a belief in ghosts walking, talking, and otherwise interacting with the living contradicted the long-held belief in forefather praise, in which the dead taken pleasure in a presence removed from the world of mortality and strife. Reports of apparitions were never received well in old China, as they were analyzed to mean the dead were troubled, the natural order upset. The Warring States period was concluded with the victory of the state of Qin over the other 6 states and the ascent of the first emperor of China, Shi Huangdi, reigned 221 to 210 BCE. Following Shi Huangdi's rise to power, the Chinese emperor ordered the burning of all books which did not support his philosophy of legalism or his dynasty's variation of history. The works of Confucius, Moti, and many others were burned, but Confucian concepts endured through the devotion of his adherents and the extensive approval of his precepts, which were revived during the Han Dynasty. Taoism also made it through because its precepts had long been implanted in the culture through its close association with folklore and legend. Moti's philosophy, though, which had never gotten as prevalent acceptance as either of these, was mostly forgotten, as was his name, by the time the Han Emperor Wu the Great, reigned 141 to 87 BCE, made Confucianism the national philosophy of China. Moti's work was more or less overlooked until the Communist Party of China restored interest in it in the mid-20th century CE, recognizing in it a kind of proto-communist vision. Today he is recognized as one of China's greatest thinkers, and his idea of consequentialism is regarded as on par with any other philosophical system. Chapter 3. Aristippus of Cyrene. Aristippus of Cyrene, circa 435 to 356 BCE, was a hedonistic Greek philosopher who was one of Socrates' students in addition to other pupils like Plato, Xenophon, Antisthenes, and Phaedo. He was the first of Socrates' students to charge a fee for teaching, and, since Socrates had charged nothing, this, and the accusation he had betrayed Socrates' philosophy, created a lifelong friction between Aristippus and Socrates' other disciples. He believed and taught that the meaning of life was enjoyment, and that the pursuit of satisfaction, therefore, was the noblest course one could devote oneself to. It is hard to comprehend at first how Aristippus could have been a student of Socrates, so different seemed their philosophies. Nevertheless, Aristippus's most well-known phrase, I'm not possessed, is quite in line with Socrates' own view of life, as presented by Plato and Xenophon, the 2 primary sources on Socrates' life. Aristippus's philosophy. Plato presents Socrates as a man who typically enjoyed drinking red wine but who never ever got drunk, who went to parties but never had the cash to host one himself, and who seems to have lived mainly, in his later years at the very least, on monetary gifts from friends and admirers. Xenophon doesn't contradict Plato on any of the above points. While Socrates could in no way be considered a hedonist, it is relatively simple to see how a young disciple of his could come to the conclusion that taking pleasure in those things money can purchase, without being a slave to the money with which to purchase such things, would seem a useful philosophy. Farther, Socrates' routine of drinking greatly, but never ever appearing drunk, or trying to obtain more red wine, would be in line with Aristippus's philosophy of having or enjoying something without being possessed by that thing. While Socrates chased after truth and looked for understanding, Aristippus streamlined the teaching of his master by claiming the greatest truth one could get was the recognition that pleasure was the purpose of human existence and the pursuit of pleasure was the meaning of life. In this, and in his refuse for the ones that complex matters by thinking too exactly on them, he would be a kindred spirit of the Chinese hedonist philosopher Yang Zhu, 440 to 360 BCE, who claimed that concerns about right and wrong were a waste of time, because there is no God, no afterlife, and no reward for suffering unnecessarily by rejecting oneself when one could as quickly and more sensibly enjoy life in the present. Plato's discussion of the Phaedo defines the last day of Socrates' life when his disciples came to visit him in his jail cell in Athens and they had their final philosophical discussion. The discussion begins with the Pythagorean thinker Echecrates meeting Socrates' student Phaedo, who was there at the jail and present at Socrates' death, and asking him to tell of the experience in the jail on the last day. Phaedo lists the ones that existed, and Echecrates asks, "But Aristippus and Cleombrotus, were they present?" To which Phaedo replies, "No, they were not. They were said to be in Aegina, 59c. As the Isle of Aegina was called an enjoyment resort, Plato definitely knew what he was doing in putting the hedonistic philosopher there instead of in attendance in Socrates' last hours. Whether the Cleombrotus pointed out in Phaedo is the exact same man who Callimachus says jumped to his death after reading Plato's description of the afterlife and the journey of the soul in the dialogue of the Phaedo isn't known. But if Cleombrotus was with Aristippus on Aegina, it may safely be presumed they were not there participating in philosophical discourse, as Plato would have specified it, but would have been pursuing enjoyment. As Plato did not approve of Aristippus, as it seems he didn't approve of most of Socrates' other disciples, nor they of him, the line referencing Aristippus's preference of satisfaction on Aegina to philosophical discussion in an Athenian jail cell would have been meant by Plato to demonstrate how shallow Aristippus and his philosophy was. The ancient author Diogenes Laertius, 3rd century CE, points out Plato's jab against Aristippus in Plato's book on the soul, as the Phaedo was called. However, Aristippus, like Socrates, focused his attention on practical ethics. The question, "What is the good?" was in the leading edge of his belief system. The values people term good or wicked are reducible to pleasure and pain. Self-gratification, then, is a great excellent, while self-restraint in the face of certain pleasure would be bad. Still, Aristippus preserved that one should not allow oneself to be had by those things which bring satisfaction. According to Diogenes Laertius, when Aristippus was slammed for keeping a very pricey mistress named Laius, he replied, "I have Laius, not she me." There was nothing at all wrong, then, with enjoying whatever it was one wanted to enjoy, provided that one knew the supreme value of that thing or person, and did not confuse that value with somebody's own personal flexibility. In Aristippus's view, one should never ever trade one's freedom for anything. Self-restraint and self-gratification, then, were of equal value in maintaining an individual's personal liberty while pursuing the good in life, satisfaction. Aristippus at court. Aristippus lived at the court of the tyrant Dionysius the First of Syracuse, 432 to 367 BCE, or maybe of his child Dionysius the Younger, 397 to 343 BCE, where he was highly paid for his teaching and writing. When he initially came to the palace, Dionysius asked him what he was doing there, and apparently he said, "When I wanted wisdom, I went to Socrates, but now that I want money, I have come to you." The unpredictability of which king Aristippus lived with just because of the primary sources referencing Dionysius without clarifying whether the dad or the child, and as their personalities were comparable, it could be either. Plato had attempted to turn Dionysius the Younger into his theorist king and failed, and so if Aristippus served that king, it would further explain Plato's enmity to Aristippus, despite the fact that no more explanation is required than Aristippus's philosophy of enjoyment. Diogenes Laertius tells us that Aristippus was a man really fast at adjusting himself to each kind of place and time and person, and he easily supported each change of fortune, for which reason he was in greater favor with Dionysius than any of the others, as he always made the best of existing scenarios, for he enjoyed what was before him happily, and he did not labor to obtain himself the satisfaction of what wasn't present. 3. His position at the court was essentially sensible man or counselor, but according to the age-old reports, he seems to have spent much of his time just enjoying himself at the expense of Dionysius. Diogenes Laertius shows this, writing, "One day he asked Dionysius for some money, who said, 'But you told me that a smart man would never be in want.' 'Give me some,' Aristippus rejoined, 'and then we will talk about that point.' Dionysius gave him some. 'Now then,' said he, 'you see that I don't want cash.' 4. He obviously lived extremely luxuriously at the court, where among his students he taught his daughter Orate about philosophical hedonism. She in turn passed his teaching down to her son, Aristippus the younger, also known as Aristippus the mother taught, just because he was raised by his mother alone, who formalized the theories in his own writings. The theories of Aristippus and his Cyrenaic school would later impact the thought of Epicurus and his philosophy concerning the primacy of satisfaction in comprehending the ultimate meaning in an individual's life. Aristippus's writing and later on life. According to some age-old sources, Aristippus wrote many books, while according to others, none. The main source of anecdotes concerning his life is Diogenes Laertius, who has been slammed for not mentioning his sources, but points out Aristippus's written operate in the exact same passage where he says he wrote absolutely nothing. One of the works credited to him was on ancient luxury, no longer extant, which appears to have been a type of scandal sheet detailing the less philosophical affairs and dalliances of Greek thinkers with young kids, and with particular attention paid to Plato. While it is totally possible Aristippus could have written such a work, it doesn't seem constant with his character. He regularly appears to have regarded himself exceptional to his contemporaries, especially to Socrates' other students, and it seems unlikely he would have expended the effort to write anything about them at all. Aristippus lived into aging after a life of luxury and satisfaction and retired to his hometown of Cyrene, where he passed away. His daughter and grandson systematized his philosophy, and Aristippus the Younger is thought to have officially established the Cyrenaic school of philosophy, one of the earliest so-called Socratic schools originally established by Aristippus himself based on his grandpa's theories. Chapter 4. Similarities between Eastern and Western philosophy. Since the, quote, discovery of Eastern philosophy by Western explorers and experts in the 18th and 19th centuries CE, there has been an arbitrary division kept, especially in institutions of higher learning, between Western philosophy and Eastern philosophy. Like these two systems present significantly different views of the world. There's no division between Eastern or Western philosophers when it comes to the most standard questions of what it means to be a person. The essential purpose of philosophers is to find meaning in an individual's life and purpose to one's course, and there's no major difference between Eastern and Western philosophy according to that understanding. The purpose of human existence. The resemblances between Eastern and Western philosophy are greater than any differences cited by modern-day authors and speakers on the subject. The most typically cited difference is that Western philosophy is fragmentary, while Eastern philosophy is holistic. The well-known writer Sankara Saranam, author of the book God Without Religion, is one example of this, when he claims that Eastern philosophy is worried about general knowledge, while Western philosophy targets at specific knowledge. This refers to the well-known understanding that Eastern philosophy, specifically Chinese philosophy, addresses the entirety of human existence, while Western philosophy, beginning with the Greeks, only focuses on certain elements of the human condition. An example given by scholastic experts is how Confucius's Analects deal with both the inner and outer life of a person, holistic, while Aristotle's works stress how one should perform someone's self to live well, to name a few, fragmentary. Moti, some claim, aims at a holistic understanding of an individual's self and one's environments, while a Western thinker like Plato underlines specific goals one should pursue in discovering what is actually true and real in life. These are approximate differences which completely miss out on the underlying and basically similar objectives of Eastern and Western philosophy. Further, such differences misshape a person's perception of history in that once people accept a basic distinction between East and West, they could tend to see the history of respective societies as significantly different from each other. Actually, human beings are essentially the same the world over. Only the specifics and customs vary, and the philosophies of Eastern and Western thinkers make this rather clear. One could compare the essential ideas of the great Chinese theorist Confucius, 551 to 479 BCE, with those of the Greek theorist Aristotle, 384 to 322 BCE, and find they exist the exact same fundamental ideas. Both guys actually believed that virtue was the greatest objective one could pursue, and that lasting benefits came to a person who put virtue above worldly belongings. The Korean thinker Won-hyo, 617 to 686 CE, wrote, "Thinking makes good and bad, meaning that if you think something is bad, then it is bad to you." The Greek philosopher Epictetus, circa 50 to 130 CE, said the exact same thing when he wrote, "It isn't circumstances themselves that trouble people, but their judgments about those scenarios." Enchiridion 1:5. Epictetus says that one should not even fear death, just because one does not know whether death is a pretty good or a bad thing. Won-hyo would agree with that, since he believed that every little thing was one, and all of the experiences a person has in life are just a part of the one experience of being a human being. The relativist approaches of the Chinese sophist Tongxi, 6th century BCE, and the Greek sophist Protagoras, 5th century BCE, are almost similar. The criticism that Moti and Plato focus on different ends, discussed above, is illogical, in that both thinkers make clear that one should concentrate on the enhancement of the self before one tries to enhance others. Innate morality. The best example, however, of the essential sameness of Eastern and Western thought is represented in the works of two of the best-known philosophers from their respective hemispheres, Plato, 428 to 348 BCE of the West, and Wang Yangming, 1472 to 1529 CE of the East. While Plato is quite popular in the West, Wang Yangming is less so, despite the fact that he is as well known as Plato in China, Korea, and Japan. Both of these philosophers have applied an enormous influence through their works, and both argue for the existence of inherent knowledge, that people are born knowing right from wrong and good from bad, and need only be encouraged to chase after goodness so as to live a satisfying life. The works of both these guys handle what is good and what is the right way to understand one's existence. In his Dialogue of Phaedrus, Plato postures the question, what is good and what's not really good? Need we ask anyone to tell us these things? His coach, Socrates, the main character in Phaedrus, as in the bulk of Plato's works, asks this question of his associate Phaedrus relating to the quality of writing. In Plato's view, a person already knows what is good, since that individual will respond innately to the quality of goodness in the writing, and will also respond to the principle of goodness in an individual's life. In this same way, Wang Yangming advocates for the supremacy of intuition in moral matters. Wang would agree with Plato that anybody can recognize what's good and not that good regarding morality. Wang's and Plato's philosophies have been attacked by empiricists for a lack of evidence, but what these two theorists are contending makes sense on a really standard level. One should know what's good so as to go after what's good, and this knowledge of the good must be inherent in order for people to have the desire to pursue it in the first place. Further, they argue, humans must recognize what is not good to reject it, and for this reason, don't really need to be taught goodness, but only be directed or educated to act on their innate knowledge of the good. The empiricist argument that there is a lack of evidence for natural knowledge cannot be supported by empirical facts. An individual must be aware that they are supposed to chase after something before they can pursue it. Wang's theory of instinct could be contrasted with one of the most fundamental of human needs, eating. No infant is ever taught that it should be hungry, and no child is ever advised in making their need for food known to grown-ups. The infant weeps to let an adult know that it must be fed, and the kid verbalizes that exact same need in words or deeds, like saying, "I am hungry," or going to get something to eat. The recognition of appetite is an inherent human quality which doesn't need to be taught, and Wang says the same is actually true of morality. All that should be taught is how to apply that inherent knowledge properly, in the same way that a kid is taught the appropriate way to request for food. In Plato's Meno, Socrates praises a servant who knows geometry though he has never ever been taught it. Plato uses this slave boy as an example of inherent knowledge to show that people already know innately what they consider being taught, and that this goes for knowledge of goodness and also anything else. Just as a child knows when it is hungry, a person knows how to be good. Wang and Plato both agree that what avoids an individual from acting upon what they know is self-centered desires which confuse people and make them choose to act badly even when they know they should not. The distinctions between the concepts of Wang and Plato are only cosmetic and linguistic. There's no difference in their essential ideas. Thinkers from the East have always been participated in exactly the exact same pursuit as their equivalents in the West. There is no Eastern or Western philosophy. There is only philosophy. The love of wisdom knows no separate region. Philosophy defies all boundaries and each kind of petty local definition. This has been Philosophy, Eastern versus Western Philosophy Explained. Written by Philip Rivaldi. Narrated by Doug Green.